Hey guys, what's up? Today we're listening to My Hero Academia, Blink. So sit back, relax, and just enjoy the ride. And hey, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. I promise, I'm a lot more fun to hang out with. And if you're one of the OGs, welcome back. You already know, Shizi is about to get real.
Chapter 1 Prologue. I thought I would die a normal death. Keyword, normal. But it seems I didn't. I would have to agree, Blanc. Looking at the white silhouette of a human reminiscent of truth in front of him, Blanc didn't have much to say, 'cause he did indeed die a rather stupid death. Enjoying a rather entertaining fanfic reading session, and then suddenly a truck had rammed through the wall and instantly killing him. How morbid. But there wasn't much Blanc could even do, seeing as he was a rather normal human who couldn't dodge at the speed of light. So an average man dead. How tragic. Let's look at the bright side. It seems that the trope of a ROB did indeed exist. How optimistic of a person who just died. Resting their chin on his palm, ROB, somehow without eyes, gave off the feeling of amusement with just his tone. How is that even possible? Anything is possible for me, Blanc. So, you ready to get reincarnated? It wasn't like he could do much against it, so might as well enjoy the reincarnation experience. Who knows, maybe it'll be pretty smooth sailing. Now that's the attitude. ROB clapped in amusement, before manifesting a wheel filled with countless names. So it's this trope then? Yup. Don't fix what ain't broken, you feel me? That's true. Rather, Blanc was kind of grateful that it was like this, instead of some new confusing trope that made everything overcomplicated. Simple was perfect. So, 3 wheels, 1 for the world, 1 for your power, and 1 for your circumstances, that fine with you? Blanc nodded. Sounded pretty good. While it would suck if he landed on a post-apocalyptic world like Last of Us, Warhammer 40k, or even GGZ, there wasn't much Blanc could do other than pray to God, or ROB, to get a good world. After all, what would something like 6 Eyes even do in Warhammer? Let him see his death in 4K? So it was all in the compatibility. Even if Blanc knew that his future wasn't really in his hands, it was normal to feel nervous looking at the wheels spin at a speed faster than he could even see. Blanc looked at the wheel slowing down, passing worlds like Black Bullet, Absolute Duo, Classroom of the Elite. Well, he sighed in relief when he saw it pass Zenless Zone 0. Rather, any world with a major crisis was a no-no in Blanc's book. Blanc watched as it barely passed Gensokyo with relief, and landed on a relatively familiar anime. My Hero Academia. Thank God. Obviously there was world-ending villains in that world, and the government was kind of corrupt, and don't even add the Quirk supremacists. But, wasn't that where the ability made up for it? Blanc hadn't technically finished the anime, rather only getting his information off dropped fanfiction and slander videos. However, that was all he needed to know, that the real issues were all set in Japan. So what does that mean? He just didn't have to be in Japan when the actual story happened, as simple as that. My Hero Academia, that isn't that bad of a pick, you're pretty lucky, huh? Blanc inwardly nodded. Now your ability. Wait. I have a question. Shoot. Does this power automatically count as my quirk, or is it completely separate? ROB somehow gave an illusion of a grin at the question, humming in thought. I guess it's separate? Nice. Nice indeed, Blanc. So no more questions? Nope. Then here's your power. Without the threat of being placed into a living hell, Blanc was noticeably more relaxed. After all, with the possible threat gone, it was only normal that he didn't place much importance on power. While it obviously would be nice to have a power, Blanc wasn't greedy for much. Why else would he just spend his days reading fanfiction all day? It wasn't like Blanc was an idiot, nor was he shut in, he read it 'cause it was fun. So, in a relaxed demeanor, Blanc watched as the wheel slowed down, passing abilities such as the Sharingan, Limitless, and even Shadow Clones. Well, the Shadow Clones would be pretty nice. But beggars can't be choosers. As the wheel slowed to a halt, Blanc nodded with satisfaction at the power that was chosen. Shirai Kuriko Template, Toru no Kagaku no Railgun. I won't be a woman, right? Nope, it's more or less her AIM diffusion field, personal reality, calculation ability, and her Esper ability. Of course, how far you get with the template depends on your efforts. Thank ROB. Your gender's a 50-50 like it's supposed to be. That isn't much to be thankful for. Who cares much about gender anyway? Everyone's human in the end after all. I can't even refute that. Now here's your final wheel. Your circumstances. Without much suspense, ROB quickly spun the wheel, which was equally packed. Blanc didn't expect much from the wheel until he saw some pretty morbid options that he probably should have expected beforehand. Test subject. Abandoned parents. Villain family. Now was the time to pray once again. Blanc watched with anticipation and nervousness. Rightfully so. What if he had teleportation if he was broke and homeless? It wasn't like he was immediately level 4 in terms of teleportation. Blanc felt his blood go cold as it just barely passed, son of all for one, before landing on the much better middle-class average family. Phew. Wow, I think you're the luckiest reincarnate today. ROB nodded in admiration. There was worse? Obviously. I think the worst one for today was GGZ. Blanc inwardly sucked in a deep breath. That's tragic. Yeah, and at that point it didn't even matter what power or family they had, they were cooked either way. Agreed. Well, Blanc, it was nice to see a rather calm guy rather than a pretentious one or an edgy one, or even one of those guys who think they're going to get a harem just for existing. They actually exist? You'd be surprised. ROB rubbed his face in both frustration and exhaustion, sighing in reminiscence. The faceless head looked up at Blanc one last time. Before you go, I used to not add this part, but after a while it's surprising how many people forget. What? The people you see, the people you meet, and the people you share experiences with are all real human beings. They aren't fiction, they aren't 2D things you saw through a book or a screen or maybe even a fanfic. They're all humans in which they share the same feelings as you do. So no matter how much you may place some weird expectations, or even try to predict their motivations just because you have prior knowledge, everything will change. Just remember this. You are just as unusual as the fictional characters you may see or meet. You aren't superior just because you saw me. You are human. Same as everyone you will meet. Blanc silently absorbed the words, then nodded. I'm just normal. At that response, ROB gave a smirk before waving at Blanc. It was nice talking to you, Blanc. Enjoy your second life, even if you're too lazy to make much of it. Chapter 2, Childhood 1. I have to say I'm grateful that I'm still male in this life. Not because I'm sexist or anything, I'd simply rather remain the way I was before I died. Blanc, now known as Shunkan Ishin, monologued silently as he watched his parents leave for work, waving them by with a smile. While I appreciate the trust you have in me, Mom and Dad, why are you leaving a 5-year-old to his own devices just because he's a little smart? Now alone in the house, Ishin wandered into his father's study. Both of his parents worked relatively normal office jobs and were financially stable. There was little Ishin could reasonably ask for. In fact, being born into the Shunkan family was close to optimal for both his personal circumstances and his quirk. Ishin had awakened his quirk at the unusually young age of 2. On the surface, it wasn't particularly impressive. Without the Shirai Kuriko template, it would have been borderline useless, or at least not worth developing in his lazy-ass opinion. His mother, Shunkan Keiko, possessed the quirk retrocognition. This quirk allowed her to perceive up to 5 seconds into the past. Rather than replaying events like a recording, it reconstructed recent occurrences by analyzing present conditions such as object positions, residual forces, sound decay, and other environmental traces. The accuracy of this reconstruction depended entirely on Keiko's ability to process and quantify environmental data, placing an extreme computational burden on her brain. Over time, the quirk forcibly enhanced her neurological capacity for calculation and probabilistic reasoning, which naturally led her to pursue a career as an actuary. His father, Shunkan Genzai, possessed the quirk hypercognition. Hypercognition dramatically increased Genzai's ability to process real-time sensory input through all 5 senses, allowing him to recognize patterns and causal relationships almost instantly and respond with exceptional efficiency. However, rather than increasing raw intelligence, the quirk accelerated perception, thought, and decision-making. Genzai experienced the world with virtually no perceptual latency, similar to a supercomputer evaluating every viable outcome based solely on incoming sensory data. Because the quirk functioned almost passively, prolonged exposure to unfamiliar or stimulus-dense environments caused severe information overload. When overload occurred, Genzai's nervous system would forcibly shut down via induced sleep as a protective mechanism. As a result, whenever he left familiar environments, Genzai relied on a combination of ear mufflers, blindfolds, and masks to limit sensory intake. While this made him ineligible for a driver's license, his profession as an appraiser required minimal physical travel. Shunkan Ishin, inheriting traits from both parents, was born with a quirk officially classified as precognition. At least that was the doctor's conclusion. In actuality, Ishin's ability did not truly allow him to see the future. Instead, it functioned by aggregating sensory input, performing high-speed probabilistic calculations, and projecting the most plausible near-future outcomes. However, Quirk was classified as an emitter type rather than a cognitive derivative of his parents' abilities. The reasoning was simple. Labeling it as a mutant-type cognitive quirk implied permanent neurological alterations that would place an unacceptable processing burden on a child, which was unrealistic just looking at Ishin's rather painless, bored expression. Emitter classification allowed the precognition to be treated as externally generated phenomena, theoretically reducing the risk of neural overload, which would explain why Ishin didn't experience any visible burden. The doctor suggested reassessing the quirk once more data became available, but both Genzai and Keiko declined further testing. As long as their son was healthy and safe, they agreed to revisit the matter when Ishin was older. What neither the doctor nor his parents realized was that Ishin's quirk had been a mutant type from the very beginning. The difference was that the level 4 calculation ability granted by the teleportation template allowed Ishin to absorb and process information without immediate neurological strain. More importantly, continuous forced quirk-assisted analysis caused Ishin's computational capacity to grow gradually to accommodate the information, reinforcing itself through use rather than overwhelming him all at once. So while the precognition was technically passive, due to Ishin's level 4 computational ability, it allowed him to see much further into the future, or not see it at all. With Ishin's computational ability surpassing multiple high-spec computers, this technically allowed for further advancement for teleportation. The technically was in quotation marks for a reason. Ishin understood that within the Toru universe, teleportation operated through interaction with the 11th dimension, requiring precise mathematical formulas to interface with it. Fortunately, ROB had provided the same 11th dimensional interaction formulas used by Shirai Kuriko as part of the template. Unfortunately, that was all he had been given. Without knowing what each parameter represented or how to supply correct values, Ishin was forced to deconstruct the equations piece by piece until he fully understood their function. Complicating matters further, Ishin remembered almost nothing about mathematics beyond a high school level, which meant that he had to effectively start from the beginning. Ishin looked with a dead expression in front of the computer, rubbing his platinum blonde hair in frustration. Linear algebra. The actual bane of his existence. While he could brute force calculations, if he didn't understand what each calculation did, then it was effectively pointless. It may have been relatively simple to just relearn things he had previously learned. When venturing into new territory, it was rather annoying. He tried to brute force it earlier, but the pencil he attempted to teleport had ended up partially spliced into a coloring book, fused cleanly through several pages. After multiple desperate and increasingly futile attempts to free the pencil, Ishin had eventually sighed and given up. It wasn't like permeation where it would get pushed out. His working theory was that, due to his personal reality, anything occupying the same space as his teleportation target would be displaced somewhere else. Possibly the so-called 11th dimension. Or, in simpler terms, violently erased. So yeah. No more experimenting until he actually understood the mechanics behind the formula. While relying on the organic chemistry tutor was good, it couldn't really compare to actual professors. So this inevitably led to the rabbit hole of searching for recorded college lectures. Staring at a screen this long is definitely going to mess up my eyesight. After an hour of dense explanations, Ishin stretched his short arms, let out a tired sigh and hopped off the chair. Juice sounded good right about now. Halfway to the kitchen, an unexpected sound echoed through the house. Beep beep. A guest? With an eyebrow raised, Ishin deigned to ignore the ringing door, making his way to the door viewer his parents installed on their home. A child? Well, he supposed he couldn't judge. He was a kid too. Are they the new neighbors who are moving in this week? He remembered the family next door had moved out after having their fourth child, opting for a bigger house. Damn, were those kids loud as hell. Snapping out of the memory of endless hero and villain games, Ishin focused back on the girl outside. She was inspecting the door with unrestrained curiosity, knocking lightly on the wood and peering at the frame. This looks like the type of person I'd not want to hang out with. Not that he had much room to be picky. The number of friends he'd had in his previous life could be counted on one hand. Still, she looks really familiar though. Sifting through his memories of My Hero Academia, Ishin could somewhat remember who the person in front of him was. Nay something. Nejima? Nejimi? Nejire? Man, he really sucked with names. Even with that nagging familiarity, Ishin didn't open the door. He was home alone, and while his parents trusted him, he wasn't about to do anything that might get them labeled negligent. It wasn't like his parents were actually negligent, they cared for him and played with him quite a lot even if it was one-sided. It was more of mutual trust. And damn it if Ishin wouldn't uphold his end of trust. Besides, being home alone was easily a top 5 life experience. Even if he couldn't remember Nay something's exact personality, her hyperactive demeanor was pretty obvious. Wait, where did she go? Ishin leaned closer to the screen. The periwinkle-haired girl was gone. Is she a fucking animatronic, moving away while I'm not looking? After a moment he shrugged and turned back toward the kitchen. Guess that solves the problem. At least I can delay meeting her until my parents get home and do that whole Japanese new neighbor greeting thing. Thump. Huh? Ishin looked around the house. A ghost? A chill went down his back. Even though Ishin knew that ghosts couldn't exist, it didn't stop him from being scared of horror games. But the question was quickly answered with another thumping noise, coming from the kitchen window. There she was. The periwinkle-haired girl hovered unsteadily in midair, supported by glowing yellow spiral waves of energy twisting around her legs and back. The energy pulsed unevenly, pushing her up in short bursts rather than smooth flight. She was clearly inexperienced. Every few seconds she'd tilt too far and overcorrect, wobbling like a fish flopping out of water. But despite the clumsiness, she looked thrilled. With a wide, beaming smile, she waved enthusiastically whenever she managed to stabilize herself for more than a second. Ishin just stared. What the hell? Chapter 3, Childhood 2. Ishin's first reaction to the periwinkle-haired girl waving at him was, "What the fuck?" Thankfully, Nejire couldn't hear through the window, nor was she an expert at lip reading. The second reaction that Ishin had to Nejire was an awkward wave. For a brief moment, he considered simply ignoring her and closing the curtains. Still, Ishin knew enough about social interactions to understand that arbitrarily antagonizing the neighbors was a bad idea. Nejire, however, didn't seem discouraged in the slightest. If anything, she waved harder once she realized he was responding. Might as well. With a quiet sigh, Ishin grabbed a cushion from one of the dining room chairs and placed it on the floor beneath the window. After that, he unlocked it and slid the window open. As expected, Ishin neatly sidestepped as Nejire lunged forward, watching with a tired expression as she tumbled through the opening and landed face first onto the cushion. At least she didn't get hurt. Nor was he the cushion. With the computational ability far surpassing both his parents, it wasn't surprising that Ishin could calculate a decent amount into the future. Not in clear visions or prophecy, but more like predictive overlays, like looking at future frames in an animation, translucent projections of what could happen based on current motion, senses, and intent. Ishin could easily keep it at a solid 5 seconds in the future, but with any time above 7 seconds, the margin of error was much higher, leading to multitudes of overlapping projections. The future appeared like a warped, semi-transparent 3D playback layered over reality, and leaving it active for too long made him feel extremely nauseous. Ishin didn't know how his quirk was able to see 5 seconds into the future in a lecture. Just through his enhanced senses, watching a lecture 5 seconds into the future was a rather motion sickness-inducing experience. Maybe I should just get used to it at some point. Don't really want my vision to be in Sandevistan vision 24/7 though. He mentally filed that thought away and focused back on the present as Nejire bounced to her feet, seemingly unfazed. She stared at him with unrestrained curiosity. "Hello," she said, beaming. "Hello," Ishin replied, returning the smile with effort. "What's your name?" "My name's Hado Nejire. My family just moved here from Akita Prefecture. I'm 7 years old. My quirk is called wave motion." "Oh, what's your quirk? Your hair looks really cool." Ishin watched her step closer with every sentence. Wait. He raised a hand. She tilted her head. At least give me a chance to answer your question before you go off on your tangent. He pinched the bridge of his nose. If he didn't interrupt her now, she'd still be talking 5 seconds from now. He consciously dampened his quirk and looked back at her. What's a tangent? Let me ignore that. My name is Ishin. I've lived here since I was born and I'm 5. My quirk is precognition. What's precognition? And a tangent is what you were doing just now. Nejire completely ignored her recent question and nodded enthusiastically. Wow, you're really smart. So what was I doing just now? Who knows? This kid might be even worse than the previous neighbors. So what's precognition? Does it have something to do with your hair? Oh. Does your hair glow when you use it? But I didn't see your hair glowing earlier. Before I answer any more questions, Ishin said carefully, can we set some rules? Nejire blinked then nodded. Her parents set rules too. Like not touching dangerous things or not flying indoors without permission. Oh no. She just broke a rule. She really didn't want to get spanked again. Why did she suddenly go quiet? Ishin watched her expression shift then sighed. How about one question at a time, he said, and if you break the rule, A flick on the forehead. That snapped her out of it. Huh? Oh. I wasn't paying attention. Ishin stared at the ceiling. This was going to be a long day. Answering Nejire's seemingly endless questions, both Ishin and Nejire didn't realize that time had passed for a while, until someone rang the doorbell once more. The sound cut Nejire off mid-question, just as Ishin was trying to explain the basics of linear algebra. Honestly, if there was someone right in front of him who let him use the Feynman technique without complaint, who was he not to take advantage of it? Who knew? Maybe Nejire was a hidden genius. Maybe she'd end up explaining teleportation theory to him. While Nejire's personality was hard to get used to in the beginning, as a person who did like explaining things, he got used to it relatively quickly. Ring ring. The doorbell finally snapped Ishin out of it. He stood up from the couch, Nejire immediately following close behind. The height difference due to age might have resulted in an eyebrow twitch on Ishin's end. There wasn't much he could do. He'd heard kids needed a lot of sleep to grow properly, but his own high school self clearly hadn't known anything. He checked the screen beside the door. An unfamiliar woman stood outside, her features strikingly similar to the 7-year-old peeking out from behind him, only older and visibly worried. Oh, that's my mom. Nejire's face lit up instantly. Yeah, it seems so. He moved toward the door, instinctively nudging his precognition, just enough to skim for potential outcomes. Thankfully, it was just mainly awkward conversation and mild scolding to Nejire. Good. He mentally picked out a decent excuse for why his parents weren't home. Oh, that's my mom. Nejire repeated, her tone noticeably different. Ishin glanced back at her, puzzled, then hummed thoughtfully. After all, right on Nejire's forehead was a very noticeable red mark after a few times where Nejire had asked too many questions at once. Was that why? He speculated, but Nejire answered his questions soon after. I only said I was going to say hi. Are you serious? Ishin stared at her in disbelief. Nejire, to her credit, seemed to understand exactly how ridiculous that sounded. She flushed slightly and waved her hands defensively. Don't worry. As long as they know I'm safe, they're usually pretty relaxed. She nodded firmly as if trying to convince herself.
Whoa, whoa, whoa! Hold up. Stop for a sec. Look, if you've already made it this far into the video and you're still here, come on, subscribe, bro. Help a brother out, man. It's one tiny click for you, but it's a massive, and I mean massive, heck yeah for me. Plus, it keeps the algorithm from thinking I'm boring, and we both know that's a total lie. All right. I'm done. I'll get out of the way now so you can get back to the good stuff. Stick around and finish listening. It's worth it. Peace.
I don't know about that one, Chief. Ishin shook his head in exasperation, opening the door. Hello, a child? The woman quickly smoothed her worried expression into something gentler, presumably not to scare the child. Too bad her efforts were on a child who could care less about it. Hello. Do you need anything? Oh. I'm Hado Shirori from next door. We just moved in and Nejire-chan? She leaned forward, eyes widening as she spotted a familiar silhouette attempting to hide behind Ishin. Ishin, who knew where the conversation would go, looked at Nejire behind him, no longer with a confident expression she held when reassuring that nothing would happen. Where's all your confidence now? Moving out of the way and opening the door fully so Shirori could fully see Nejire, he watched with minor amusement as Shirori quickly grabbed Nejire by the scruff of her clothing. Oh, here you were, Hado Nejire. Instead of Nejire's previously assured relaxed demeanor, relief and exhaustion warred on Shiori's face as she crouched slightly to meet her daughter's eyes, seemingly ignoring the red mark on her forehead. Hado Nejire. Look at your mother. Nejire obeyed, her expression with a mix of guilt and fear. Guilt for worrying her mom and fear of the punishment. Do you have any idea how worried I was? Shiori continued. You said you were just going to say hello, and then an entire hour passed without a word. Were you so excited to finally meet a peer that you forgot about us completely? And no. Nejire's eyes darted around, desperately searching for a lifeline, finally landing on Ishin. She gave him a pleading look. Ishin met her gaze, utterly unmoved. His expression clearly said, nothing I can do. Betrayal stabbed through Nejire's heart, her face naturally forming into a pout. Before she could protest, Shirori gently but firmly tilted Nejire's face back toward her. And now you're already trying to get your new friend to save you? Shirori sighed. Hado Nejire, when we get home you're getting a spanking. Nejire went pale. She looked between her mother and Ishin in sheer panic, silently begging for help. Looking at Nejire's pitiful expression, Ishin, who was weak to emotional appeal, made to support her, but was immediately intercepted at Shirori, who gave him a kind smile. Yeah, you're on your own. Thank you for looking after my Nejire-chan, Shirori said. As thanks, would you and your family like to come over for dinner? Free food? Even as Nejire resigned herself to her fate, her eyes sparkled again. She looked up at Ishin hopefully. I'll have to ask my parents once they wake up, Ishin replied, deploying the greatest excuse known to mankind, sleeping parents. But they'll probably say yes. Shirori nodded. You don't need to call me Mrs. Hado. Auntie is fine, but I don't think I caught your name. Oh yeah, I didn't introduce myself yet. But before Ishin could even respond, Nejire interjected. His name is Shunkan Ishin. Shirori calmly covered her mouth. Sorry about that, she said apologetically. My Nejire-chan is a little energetic. It's fine, Ishin said. And yes, my name is Shunkan Ishin. Then Shunkan-kun. Thank you for spending time with Nejire-chan. I hope you two get along well. Please take care of her. No problem. Isn't she older than me? Judging by Nejire's expression, she'd thought the same thing. She opened her mouth only for Shirori to intercept her again and begin dragging her home. Ishin waved once, which was unseen, and closed the door. Well, that was a weird experience. Chapter 4, Childhood 3. Test number 5 successful. Ishin glanced down at the pencil resting neatly on his desk, its atoms intact and unspliced. A small, satisfied smile tugged at his lips. This puts a smile on my face. Teleportation was a deceptively troublesome ability, mainly because in his case it wasn't a naturally self-regulating phenomenon the way most quirks were. This meant that he couldn't just cheat and hope for the best. It wasn't like Endeavor, who didn't need to consciously calculate oxygen ignition or heat expansion every time he used his flames. That man could just think of fire hot and his body would probably combust into flames. While it did have some similarities with the personal realities of espers, they still worked in opposite ways. Most quirks acted like extensions of the body. Once activated, the mutation handled the technical details automatically, compensating for human error. Ishin's teleportation from the Shirai Kuriko template offered no such assistance. In essence, it lacked an internal correction mechanism. The ability responded exactly to what he calculated through formulas with practically no margin of error. Success depended entirely on his ability to define space, distance, and orientation within vector space. While quirks primarily compensated for human error, teleportation was the complete opposite. Teleportation, or more specifically Shirai Kuriko's teleportation, worked on the basis that the user themselves are the reference point. While this undeniably made the calculation process much easier as a result, it had a lack of flexibility. Ironically, that lack of flexibility was what made it learnable. It had taken Ishin roughly 1 year to teleport reliably using himself as the reference point without disorientation, misalignment, or cellular damage. Rather, due to the constant intake of sensory data due to the mutant changes brought by precognition and passive utilization of his computation, Ishin could even say his computative abilities surpassed that of Shirai Kuriko. Processing vectors, distances, and mass distributions came almost reflexively to him now. It wouldn't be as exaggerated as teleporting an entire house to a different location. It was entirely plausible for Ishin to teleport cars. Ishin hadn't had the opportunity to experiment on distance, but that was for another time. ROB hadn't said that he would be limited to how strong Shirai Kuriko was in the Toru universe. Well, that extent would still undoubtedly be overpowered in this universe. After all, was it even possible to dodge an instantaneous attack which could result in an instant KO with an object placed directly into their head? Enough digression. After a few experiments on teleportation without using himself as a reference point, what Ishin discovered was that, attempting to use teleportation without any reference point was near impossible with his personal reality. The Earth was never stationary in the universe, with the Earth constantly in movement. And in order to prevent any accidental murders or splicing, Ishin gave up on that route. However, moving things around him using himself as the reference point was plausible. The reason why Shirai Kuriko couldn't move anything without being in contact with that object or person was that teleporting mainly involved moving objects away from the origin point, herself, through the 11th dimension. What Ishin was doing was creating a domain where he himself was the origin point as a reference point, not the takeoff point. This normally wouldn't be possible, but with the combination of the main effect of his quirk, which granted him a near omnipresent awareness, it was equally as easy to make a graph on everything around him. What happened just now was an attempt at teleporting a pencil on the floor to the desk without any issues. And it was successful. Maybe I am a genius after all? Ishin stretched and let out a tired breath. Well, that's enough experimenting for the day, might as well take a nap. Of course. Before he could even reach his bed, he sighed and shuffled toward the window. He pulled the curtains open just in time for bang, bang, bang. Shunchan? Wanna go play? This girl and that beaming smile. Nejire. Yeah. She tilted her head, eyes sparkling. Ishin hesitated for half a second before sighing. Sure. They said you couldn't spit on a smiling face. Turns out they were right. Nice. Now in the Shunkan family's backyard, Nejire put her hands on her hips in contemplation. So what should we do? You have to be kidding me. I'm going back. Before Ishin could take even one step, a pair of hands latched onto his shoulders. Wait. I was just joking, Nejire whined. Hey? What was that hey for? Nothing? She tilted her head, putting on a clearly fake look of innocence. Yeah, I'm heading back inside. I've decided. Nejire cut in. Decided what? To get a job? Let's be heroes, she declared, flashing a confident grin. Heroes? MHM. Nejire was already bouncing on her heels, clearly excited. Why? Ishin tilted his head in actual confusion. At one point, Ishin had entertained the idea of becoming a hero. Being reincarnated into a world literally called My Hero Academia made that train of thought almost unavoidable. But in reality, heroes had always felt distant to him. In the 6 years of life he'd experienced so far, his interactions with heroes and villains had been limited almost entirely to television. While the classification he was born with was the middle-class average family, with both parents having jobs, meant that their income bracket was technically in the middle-high class of society. This meant that the living conditions weren't near any crime-heavy areas. And with Ishin being a homebody plus parents who neither idolized heroes nor placed much importance on them, heroes existed in his life only as a concept. From his perspective, they were essentially just a more marketable version of the police. Why, you ask? Nejire froze. That question had caught her completely off guard. For someone as naturally curious as Nejire, it wasn't strange that a job involving flashy quirks, dangerous situations, and meeting tons of interesting people appealed to her. It was like asking a kid if they wanted to be famous. Most kids would answer yes without hesitation. But knowing Ishin for the past year, she could already imagine the look he'd give her, like she was some kind of idiot. And that annoyed her. She wanted to erase that image he had of her. She was his senpai after all. Yet for an entire year now he hadn't shown her even a shred of the respect an elder deserved. Every kohai at her elementary school respected her, even if she was only in 2nd grade. Even her parents sometimes mistook Shunchan for the older one when they played together. Look at the height difference. Look! She was a full-fledged 2nd grader, thank you very much. Shunchan wasn't even in elementary school yet. Why is she looking at me like that? Ishin watched as Nejire's face slowly twisted into a pout, her thoughts clearly spiraling out of control. Shunchan? Yeah. I want to become a hero to save everyone. She definitely copied that straight from All Might. 100%. Still, Ishin hadn't asked the question to be philosophical. They were kids after all, and kids were supposed to have fun, not plan out their entire futures before they even learned what a job application was. What was the point of worrying about adulthood now? They practically had their whole lives ahead of them. Really, he just wanted to see if Nejire would try to sound thoughtful. With her hyperactive, almost paramecium-like personality, even a clumsy excuse would mean she'd put some thought into it. But kids were whimsical by nature. Wasn't there a saying that mature children were the most heartbreaking or something like that? Wow, Nejire, Ishin said flatly, I didn't know you could even think that far ahead. Thanks. So what do we do to become heroes? Well, I heard they have to go to UA. Just like All Might. Do they? Yeah. So how do we get into UA? How do we get into UA? Now why in the world are you the one asking the question? Chapter 5, Childhood 4. In the Shunkan family's backyard there were 2 children, one sitting down and another standing up. Ishin was the one sitting, mentally exhausted after explaining a severely dumbed-down version of the Japanese education system, hero schools, and professional licenses. A few steps away, Nejire stood with her hands raised, bright spirals of energy spilling from her palms. They released small, uneven bursts of wind that fluttered the grass and kicked up dust. Okay, so if I just do it like this, whoa. The spirals wobbled violently and fizzled out. So basically, Nejire continued without pause, all I have to do is pass an entrance exam, and I can be a hero, right? She blinked, expression unusually focused as she watched her quirk misbehave. It's supposed to spin more. I think. Or maybe faster. Do you think faster helps? Ishin hesitated, tilting his head and tuning out Nejire's muttering about her quirk. Well, I guess so. It was clear that both Ishin and Nejire had drastically oversimplified the steps it took to become a hero. Then we can both be heroes. Yeah. Sure. Ishin was one of those kids who didn't really know what he wanted to do in the future. So if someone else decided for him, all the better. It was the privilege of being a child. Even if the person deciding for him was a paramecium. Wasn't your quirk pre-something? Precognition. Yeah, that. Her quirk training already forgotten, Nejire plopped down on the grass across from him, legs crossed. So how does it work? Thankfully, despite Ishin having answered this exact same question multiple times over the course of their year-long friendship, it seemed his long-term efforts to curb Nejire's question spamming were finally paying off. He was so proud. Ishin had made some new discoveries about his quirk, but explaining things like sensory input and Laplace's demon to an 8-year-old would only open the door to an entirely new barrage of questions, which Nejire would absolutely forget by the end of the day anyway. So Ishin dumbed it down. I can see 5 seconds into the future. Nejire's eyes lit up as she remembered, nodding enthusiastically. Then that means you can definitely be a hero, right? Maybe? At the vague answer, Nejire puffed out her cheeks before suddenly brightening with an idea. Well, if you can't be a hero, then I'll definitely let you work for my agency in the future. Nepotism is truly for the win. What's nepotism? Realizing that he had accidentally opened up a can of worms that Nejire wouldn't even remember tomorrow, Ishin sighed inwardly. So what are you two doing? Keiko, having come home early, took in the scene, Ishin sprawled on the grass, sweating, and Nejire lying right beside him, staring up at the sky. Welcome back, Mom. Welcome back, Auntie. I'm back. So, Nejire-chan, what did you and Shunkuin play today? We didn't play. We were training. Nejire declared, beaming. Really? Keiko raised an eyebrow, looking at her quintessentially lazy son in questioning. Ishin gave a resigned nod. Nejire saw it as training. Ishin saw it as an unfortunate cardio session. Nejire had decided that flying was important because heroes flew. That was reason enough for her. Unfortunately, every attempt ended the same way, a burst of spirals fizzling out, a wobble and… Ishin was already moving. Because he knew beforehand. He didn't stop her from trying because without any failure or any attempts made, she wouldn't grow. Instead, he positioned himself where she would land, arms braced. Again. And again. To Nejire it was obvious everything was fine. Ishin was there just before she fell onto the grass. The yard was soft and she hadn't gotten hurt yet. Nejire had completely convinced herself that, since she was under supervision by a child younger than her, training outdoors in a private backyard, not even her own, everything was perfectly safe. Additionally, and completely unintentionally, keeping Nejire safe meant Ishin had to push his precognition further than usual in response because on some occasions, 5 seconds just wasn't enough. This led to him getting used to the information input at the 7-second range as a side effect, even if it wasn't intended. In the end, the whole thing devolved into a game of catching the falling Nejire. Catch me if I fall. Nejire laughed. It was worse because she was slightly taller than him, which meant he had to calculate angles, momentum, and how not to let either of them get hurt. Multitasking at its finest. Thankfully, her quirk ran on stamina. Otherwise, the session might have gone on far longer than comfortable. So, Keiko said after a moment, are you going to be a hero in the future, Shunkuen? She sounded genuinely curious. Her perpetually lazy son suddenly showing signs of ambition was new. Still, it was nice to hear. I'll probably be a janitor for Nejire's agency, Ishin replied flatly. No. Nejire popped up. He saved me every time. That's totally hero stuff, she insisted. Keiko blinked. Now she looked even more incredulous. Her son saving someone? She'd thought they were just training. Under his mother's probing gaze, Ishin sighed. I just stopped her from falling. That's all. How is that so? Keiko hummed. What's that look for, Mom? You're not seriously shipping 2 kids, right? Well then, she said cheerfully, ruffling both their heads, I look forward to both of your hero careers, Nejire-chan. She turned toward the house, then paused. Oh, and Nejire-chan, would you like to stay for dinner? Nejire brightened, then hesitated. Can I ask my parents? I already did. They said you could decide. Then I'll eat with Shunchan. Ishin promptly ignored his mother's pointed look. Once the sliding glass door closed, Nejire turned back to him, eyes sparkling. So should we train more? Let's do different training next time, Ishin said, shaking his head. Like what? Isn't your quirk based on your stamina? How about walking? But walking is boring. Nejire protested. Then how about we go to the park nearby? While the thought of going that far exhausted him, if it meant other children could take the aggro of Nejire's enthusiasm, it was worth it. Her eyes lit up. The far one? Yeah. But Mom definitely won't let me go that far without her. She pouted. Well, we can probably ask when I walk you home. Really? Yeah, probably. Then let's go. With renewed energy, Nejire spun toward the gate, seeing as they did live right next to each other after all. Ishin, running on fumes, stopped her. How about we ask today, and if she says yes, we go tomorrow? Please say yes. Nejire thought it over, realized she'd probably be tired after dinner, and reluctantly nodded. Okay. Let's go. Chapter 6, Childhood 5. Sue, when are we leaving, Shunchan? Why is this kid in my room? Ishin stared at the periwinkle-haired girl standing right next to his bed, far too close for comfort, like it was something out of a cheap horror movie. She just scared the shit out of me. Why are you in my room at? Ishin looked at the electronic clock on the side of the bed. It read 8:12 a.m. You can't be serious. Didn't Mom say I could leave early as long as you were watching me? Nejire said brightly. So when are we leaving? She tilted her head, eyes practically sparkling with anticipation. She did say that. Although she probably didn't expect us to leave the house before noon. Maybe later? Why? Nejire asked immediately. Don't we get more time to play if we go early? She countered, her tone filled with the earnest logic of an 8-year-old. That's such a good argument, I don't even know how to respond to that. It's so early that when we get there probably won't be many people to make friends with, Ishin said after a moment. Thankfully, that made Nejire pause. She hummed thoughtfully as if the idea had never occurred to her before. After a few seconds she reluctantly nodded, her lips pulling into a small pout. Ishin should have felt relieved. Instead he hesitated, then sighed. He rolled onto his side, too tired to bother pulling the blanket with him, just in time for Nejire to leap onto the bed. Then I'll just take a nap too. Yeah, Ishin muttered. Facing away from Nejire, Ishin closed his eyes to get at least a few more minutes or even hours more sleep. Not even a second later, he sighed inwardly. Nejire, just go to bed. He heard a soft giggle behind him before it went quiet. Thank Rob. How did she even get in my room anyways? So when are we leaving now? When Ishin woke up the next time, it seemed that he had rolled around in his sleep, being face to face with Nejire, his white eyes locked with Nejire's excited blue eyes. This girl doesn't even look like she slept. Ishin slowly sat up and checked the time. 11:28 a.m. Well, that's better. Right after I wash up. Yay. So how long will that take? Nejire asked immediately. Soon. How long is soon? Ishin paused, rubbing his eyes. Soon as in not long. Oh. Nejire nodded seriously, then squinted at him. Like 5 minutes soon or 10 minutes soon or adult soon, where it's actually like half an hour? She's disturbingly perceptive for her age. 5 minutes, Ishin said flatly. Okay. Nejire chirped. She hopped off the bed, then popped right back into his line of sight. Should I count? Out loud? Or quietly? Or do you want reminders every minute so you don't forget? I will remember. Are you sure? Yes. Because a week ago. I remember, Ishin interrupted, already standing up. Nejire beamed, completely unbothered. Okay. I'll be right here. Why do I feel like that was a threat? Also, Nejire, you're getting a flick once I'm done. What? 4 questions all at once? You want 3 flicks or 1? I'll take the 1. Did you let Nejire in my room, Mom? Of course I did, Keiko replied cheerfully. She looked so excited to go to the park today. She glanced at her son with open schadenfreude. If Nejire didn't exist, this lazy boy would probably be holed up in his father's study all day. He really needed some vitamin D. Just look at how pale he was. Keiko handed Ishin an old-looking flip phone. I put a new SIM card in it this morning. Mine and Shiori's numbers are already saved, so if anything happens, call either of us. Ishin nodded, taking the phone. You know how it works, right? Keiko asked, just to be sure. Yep. Ishin pressed a few buttons, scrolling through the contacts to confirm. If we think you're responsible enough, we'll get you a real phone when you start elementary school. Now that's something to be excited about. Ah, Nejire whined, having listened in without even pretending otherwise. My mom says I can't get a phone until middle school. For good reason. Ishin muttered, earning an amused look from Keiko. Oh, and here. Keiko handed him some bills. 2,000 yen. If you get hungry, buy snacks for yourself and Nejire. Thanks, Mom. No problem. Now have fun, okay? Yeah. As they headed out, Keiko pressed a piece of toasted bread slathered with jam into each of their hands. Getting to the park wasn't technically difficult. In fact, it was extremely simple. It was only 1 bus stop away. While Ishin didn't really understand why there wasn't a park or playground closer to home, he did know it was one of the main reasons families with younger children didn't live in the neighborhood. Most of the kids around here were already in middle or high school. Nejire already had a Suica card given from her mom before she left, so after waiting for the next bus, they arrived without any trouble. Without even waiting for Ishin, Nejire marched straight up to the nearest mutant-type Quirk user, a kid with a hair of grass and flowers, and immediately began firing off question after question. Well, as long as it isn't me, I'm all for it. For younger children, having someone so openly fascinated by the very traits they wanted to feel special about was undoubtedly a good thing. Since Ishin didn't really have a purpose at the park beyond bringing Nejire here and making sure she got back, he headed toward the nearest bench and settled down. Might as well try and make a teleportation domain with the introduction of moving variables. After modifying the 11th dimensional interaction formula enough to remove the need for direct contact, even if it currently only worked on something as simple as a pencil, Ishin was essentially set, as long as he adjusted the parameters properly. If there was a limitation, it would be distance. He had never tested the upper bounds directly, but he could estimate the point at which his computational abilities would no longer be able to keep up with the constantly shifting variables. Past that specific threshold, the margin of error became so large that attempting teleportation at all would be little more than a gamble. Right now, if Ishin used the method of using himself as the origin point and the takeoff point, then the theoretical max distance without any margin of error was around 150 meters. For the teleportation after creating a domain in which everything was graphed, it was around half that, at 75 meters. Of course, this was all theoretical, based on calculations done at home. He'd never actually tested it outside, nor bothered trying. If he failed or got caught, that would be a pain. Not that he was afraid of failing, 'cause it wouldn't happen. With the movement of children and adults throughout the park, his teleportation domain shrank slightly due to the increased influx of information. The direct origin method, however, remained unaffected. Another benefit of the Kuriko method, I guess. Given the physical changes to his brain structure and nerve composition, the effective range would likely increase as his computational abilities grew with age. No reason to worry too much. His computational abilities would probably grow as long as he used it a lot, similar to a muscle. Even his precognition quirk was more used when there was more info in his general location. AFK farming, son? Never mind. Ishin glanced in Nejire's direction just in time to hear her call out to him, surrounded by a growing crowd of kids. Shunchuan? Of course. Well, I did say this counted as stamina training when I suggested it. Making his way over, Ishin took in the scene. There were a lot of kids. How did Nejire befriend this many people in like 10 minutes? Let's play heroes and villains. This stupid-ass game again? Chapter 7, Childhood 6. Who invented this shitty game that's literally the breeding ground for child bullying? Well, at least could be the breeding ground for child bullying? Ishin looked with uninterest, looking at the children playing. He tapped out a while ago, but it seemed that Nejire hadn't gotten tired at all. Maybe this really is training for her, he thought. That boundless stamina of hers. At least with Nejire's personality, she probably wouldn't allow any bullying, whether it be intentional or unintentional. Now what is this? Ishin glanced toward a group gathered around a car near the bank. Black hoodies, masks, and an obviously suspicious demeanor. 7 seconds. That bank was about to turn into a hostage situation. Are these people stupid? This is broad daylight, you know? Oh, your main method of fighting is a gun? So either useless quirks or quirkless then. To be fair, most quirks wouldn't do much against firearms anyway. Still, how did you even get guns in Japan? At least this means I can use my teleportation for something other than experiments. 7. The group adjusted their masks. 6. They opened the door, letting the 4-man group inside. 5. The glass door shut behind them with a soft click, the bell above chiming cheerfully. 4. Ishin lazily adjusted his posture on the bench, resting his chin against his palm. His pale eyes remained fixed on the bank's entrance. 3. Approximately 34 meters away. Guns still holstered. 2. No heroes approaching within the next 7 seconds. The teller's nervous. 1. The first gun in the man in the back was cleared, and the scales on his hands were barely revealed. A mutant-type quirk? 0. Vanish. The man at the front, probably the leader, reached for his pistol. Everybody, huh? The moment he tried to raise the weapon, it vanished from his hand as if it had never existed, reappearing neatly on the bank teller's counter in front of him. The same thing happened to the rest of his crew. An awkward silence settled over the lobby. The leader recovered quickly, snapping his head to the man on his left. Shiroki, cut the comms. The man with radio antennas protruding from his cheeks nodded sharply. Cutting off the comms? What will that even do? Ishin sighed inwardly. A moment later, every mask vanished from the group's faces, reappearing inside a nearby trash can. Before they could even react, their hoodies followed. Now that was awkward. Ishin glanced to his left just as Nejire approached. The other kids had already been pulled away by more observant parents. What's happening over there, Shunchan? She asked, peering toward the bank. Ishin merely shrugged. Maybe a circus performance? Should I ask? No. Ishin raised an eyebrow. Oh. Okay. Maybe it's something that kids like us wouldn't understand. Before another one of the men running for the bank teller's claws sharpened could even take more than 2 steps, they were instantly teleported back to his starting position. Whoa! That was so cool! Nejire gasped, grabbing Ishin's arm and shaking it excitedly. How did they do that? A quirk probably? Well, obviously it's a quirk, Shunchan. Maybe it's that one thing, precognition. My quirk is precognition, Ishin corrected. You mean teleportation? Yeah, that. Well, she's pretty on the dot with that one. The men were getting desperate. While they could use Shiroki's quirk to prevent anyone from calling the police, it didn't last forever and they weren't able to move even 2 feet before being sent to their previous location. Just which hero is stopping us? They had even researched the hero's patrolling schedule for the past week. Yet, before they could even do anything, their guns were gone and they couldn't even move from their position. The leader looked around the bank for anyone who looked like they were using their quirks. However, the leader would never expect the child 30 meters away in the nearby park was the culprit. They couldn't do anything other than wait for their inevitable arrest. All the people are gone, Shunchan, Nejire said, glancing around the park. What should we play now? She was still confused about why her new friends had all left at the same time, but parents were parents. Even she couldn't do anything about that. Wanna just go home? Ishin looked at the time on the flip phone. It was already 3 p.m. We can just come back tomorrow. Really? Yeah. Ishin nodded, remembering something. Glancing toward the bank one last time, he ensured the robbers had nothing left on them that could cause harm when he left, which included almost their entire attire. Then he turned away. Before Nejire could look back, Ishin gently covered her eyes and steered her toward the exit. We still have the 2,000 yen Mom gave us, he said. Wanna grab some ice cream on the way home? Ice cream? Yeah, ice cream. Chapter 8, Childhood 7. Damn, does school suck. Ishin stared ahead with indifference as the teacher at the front of the classroom introduced herself. The only real upside was that maintaining a teleportation domain in a space with hundreds of constantly shifting variables was decent mental exercise. A workout for the brain at least. He rested his chin against his palm. Ishin sat near the hallway at the back of the room, close to the rear door. It was a convenient position, even if it meant people constantly passed by on their way to their desks. So, let's start off the school year with introductions. The teacher clasped her hands together, smiling brightly. I'll go first. My name is Nejire Hado, and I'll be your homeroom teacher for the year. It's nice to meet you all. The class applauded in unison, Ishin included. As introductions went on, however, they quickly devolved into quirk demonstrations and enthusiastic declarations about becoming heroes. Why am I not surprised? Ishin watched as students proudly displayed tiger-like arms, elongated ears, and rocky skin transformations. Each flashy quirk earned louder applause than the last. Unsurprisingly, the more visually impressive the quirk, the more popular it was. If your quirk was visually interesting for these elementary students, then it was no surprise it was popular. For now, the uses of a quirk didn't matter as much as the visual appeal. A few students with emitter-type quirks that required setup or simply couldn't be displayed on quick notice returned to their seats with faint disappointment, receiving polite but noticeably weaker applause. When it was Ishin's turn, he stood and gave a simple bow. My name is Shunkan Ishin. My quirk is precognition. I want to become a hero as well. It's nice to meet you. That was it. Precognition wasn't something you could visually demonstrate, and Ishin had no intention of trying. It would have been a waste of time and effort. Still, he wasn't antisocial enough to deliberately brush off giving a decent introduction. Though, from the looks of it, his delicate and overall polished look had somewhat made up for the lack of a braggable quirk, with the amount of clapping being on the same level with more of the showy ones. Lookism really does encompass everything, even a society with superpowers, Ishin mused as he sat back down. The moment he did, his previously quiet seatmate shot up with boundless energy. Tokage Setsuna? When I grow up, I'm gonna be a hero, she announced loudly. And my quirk is this. She grabbed her head and popped it clean off. Thanks to precognition, Ishin wasn't even remotely startled. The sudden beheading visual, however, sent shockwaves through the rest of the class. About half the room erupted into delighted applause, while the other half froze in silence before offering awkward, delayed claps. Tokage! Nishijima-sensei yelped. Before the teacher could spiral into full panic, Setsuna casually plopped her head back into place, grinning as if nothing had happened. "Nice to meet you." She gave an exaggerated, theatrical bow before dropping back into her seat, clearly pleased with herself. Nishijima-sensei took a slow breath, visibly steadying herself, then cleared her throat and moved on to the next student. Isshin watched the teacher for a moment, mildly amused, before returning to his neutral expression. "What the—" He glanced to his left just in time to meet Setsuna's eyes as she leaned over, mid-whisper. She froze for a split second, like she'd been caught sneaking snacks. "So," she whispered anyway, undeterred. "What did you think?" "What am I supposed to say? That it was psychologically scarring?" Isshin thought. Outwardly, he hesitated, then answered honestly enough. "It was something?" "Really?" Setsuna's eyes lit up. She completely missed the undertone, but hey, it wasn't a no, was it? "Yeah. Nice." She nodded, satisfied, and immediately turned to the student on her other side as he sat down after his introduction to ask the same question. "Thank Rob she isn't fixated on me, it's for everyone. I was already thankful Nejire isn't in the same grade as me, but if there were a Nejire clone sitting next to me, it would have been a loud year." Isshin leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing in thought. Tokage Setsuna? That name sounded way too familiar. This act of vigilantism is the work of a teleporter. The statement alone was enough to draw grim expressions from the senior members present. After reviewing all available footage before it had been cut out due to an electronic disruption quirk, Tsukachi Naomasa replayed the key moment in slow motion once more. On screen, a firearm abruptly appeared directly in front of the bank teller, popping into existence without warning. The meeting room was filled with several pro-heroes alongside high-ranking members of the police force. While acts of vigilantism always warranted investigation due to their violation of the quirk restriction laws, this case was in a different category altogether. From the limited footage alone, several conclusions could be drawn. First, the user did not need to be anywhere near the scene. Second, there was no visible signifier preceding and announcing the teleportation, no glow, distortion of space, or even an activation cue. Third, the ability was powerful enough to relocate an adult male with ease. There was no doubt about its potency. This was a spatial-type quirk operating far beyond the norm. Spatial-type quirks were already exceptionally rare, comparable to advanced healing quirks. However, this case stood apart even among them. Most known spatial abilities either required visible activation, suffered from range or mass limitations, or were weak enough to be dismissed as situational. This one had none of those drawbacks in first impression. A spatial quirk this powerful and versatile, with no apparent limitations, implied near unrestricted use, meaning it could be used anytime, anywhere, with no observable risk to the user getting discovered in any way, shape, or form. And if there truly were no downsides, then apprehending this vigilante, now or in the future, would be extraordinarily difficult to the point of near impossibility. "Was there anyone near the crime scene who appeared suspicious?" one of the heroes asked. Naomasa shook his head calmly. "I've already cross-referenced the quirks of every individual present in the bank at the time. None of them possess a quirk even remotely consistent with what we observed." As the video cycled through multiple camera angles surrounding the area, one of the newer heroes hesitated before raising his hand. "Doesn't that kid look suspicious?" He zoomed in on a still frame showing a vanilla-haired boy and a periwinkle-haired girl observing from a distance, focusing on the boy's notably disinterested expression. Naomasa shook his head again. "No. The child does not possess a quirk related to teleportation or spatial manipulation. He does, however, have a quirk that could explain that reaction, but I can't disclose the details." Like spatial quirks, time-related abilities were also exceptionally rare and closely monitored. Pro-heroes like Sir Night-Eye were a prime example. While Shunkan Isshin's precognition of seeing 5 seconds into the future wasn't particularly flashy, knowing what would happen ahead of time and lacking the context of what followed after the electronic jamming made his lack of visible reaction unsurprising. Although Naomasa himself didn't know the exact sequence of events once the feed was cut, eyewitness reports stated that the criminal's clothing had been teleported away. Additionally, footage from a more distant camera, one unaffected by the jamming, showed the boy covering the girl's eyes as they walked away. That detail alone all but ruled him out as the culprit. Another rookie hero raised her hand hesitantly. So, if we don't know who the vigilante is and we have 0 leads, why were we called in? A senior hero lightly elbowed her for the blunt question, but Neo Mesa answered regardless. This meeting is about awareness, he said evenly. The existence of an ability like this one with no visible limitations and extreme versatility means crimes can occur right under our noses. He glanced around the room. As a result, if anyone encounters even the smallest clue or anomaly that may relate to this teleporter, it is imperative that you report it immediately to fellow heroes or directly to the police force. The rookie hero nodded slowly. That made sense. Hey, Shunchan. So, how was your first day of school? Nejire asked as she fell into step beside Ishin. Ishin shrugged lightly. About how a first day usually goes. I think. Nejire nodded rapidly. That's good. Yeah. There were a lot of people whose quirks might interest you, Ishin added, thinking briefly. The first thing that came to mind was that whole beheading stunt. Really? Nejire bounced on her heels. Then I have to go see it tomorrow. Yeah. There was this one girl who could just take her head off, Ishin said flatly. Scared the teacher pretty badly. Nejire whined. I should have been there. Why couldn't we be in the same class? Ishin could only shrug again. They stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the pedestrian light to change. Any more cool quirks? Nejire asked, filling the silence almost instantly. Well, there was this guy whose eyes glowed when he pinched his nose, Ishin said. Nejire gasped. What color? He said any color he could think of. He did a whole rainbow. Ishin continued answering while Nejire continued asking, the conversation overlapping naturally as the pedestrian light flipped to green. What color fur did the kid with animal hands have? Was it blue? Nejire, completely absorbed, stepped forward. But Ishin didn't. He quickly grabbed her sleeve, keeping her beside him. At the same time, he reached out and caught the sleeve of a woman and the child she was holding, pulling them both back a step. The woman blinked in surprise. Excuse me? The mother asked, along with a confused tilt of the head from the child. Ishin turned to her, already speaking. Sorry. I thought I saw a bug on your back and wanted to let you know. Hunk. A massive truck roared past the crosswalk, exactly where they would have stepped moments earlier. 2 pro heroes blurred by soon after, clearly in pursuit. Ishin cast the truck a brief glance before returning his attention to the woman. But I must have been mistaken. He bowed quickly. The woman stared at the truck getting further away for half a second, then turned back toward Ishin with a thankful expression and returned the bow, tightening her grip on her child, who looked between them in wide-eyed confusion. He gave a small wave at the receding mother-child pair as they crossed the road. Ishin turned back to Nejire. And no, Nejire, I'm pretty sure the fur was orange. Kind of whitish. Nejire, however, wasn't even paying attention to the previous conversation anymore. Whoa. How did you know there was, precognition? Never mind. She clapped her hands together. That was so cool. You're catching on, Ishin said, allowing himself a small, tired smile. You were all like stop, and then whoosh, and you didn't even freak out. Nejire reenacted the entire thing with dramatic flair. MHM. Ishin merely nodded along at Nejire's dramatic reenactment of what was basically a 30-second interaction. That's why I'm saying we have to be heroes. Nejire declared. Me and you, same energy. We can be the Vanilla and Berry team. Yeah, Ishin replied. I'm being serious. Chapter 9, Childhood 8. So you're saying that you and Nejire-chan want to join a dojo? Keiko and Shirori looked across the table at the 2 children after dinner. One wore a confident grin while the other looked quietly resigned. As usual, both mothers turned their attention to the more responsible child, Ishin. Yeah, Nejire said brightly. Do you need a reason? Shunchan has a bunch. She turned toward him decisively, completely confident in her choice of spokesperson. Both parents followed her gaze. Ishin could only offer them a helpless glance. Beside him, Nejire was practically bouncing in her seat, thrilled at what she clearly considered another step on the path to becoming a hero. Rewinding a few hours earlier, Nejire and Ishin were walking home from school. Hey, Shunchan, what happened to our hero training? After her stream of questions about her recent math homework finally stalled, the thought resurfaced. So she finally realized. With elementary school starting for both of them, their daily schedules no longer resembled the life of the unemployed. Somewhere along the way, Nejire had unconsciously forgotten about her and Shunchan's hero training. "We don't really have time after school," Ishin said. "Didn't you say you needed help with your math homework?" Ishin attempted to smoothly transition the conversation, but as if the outcome was inevitable, Nejire kept circling back to the conversation of hero training. "Yeah, that too, but we should still train," Nejire said, poking his shoulder. "Sue, I heard from a friend that they go to a martial arts dojo where they're learning how to be a hero." Who? Who put this idea into this cotton ball's head? That probably didn't even exist for elementary schoolers. Her friend had definitely been misinformed or just wanted to brag. This wasn't a world that trained child soldiers. Ishin complained internally, but Nejire kept going, clearly trying to convince him. "And we can definitely get stronger there," she added, smiling brightly. Shunchan had told her before that becoming a hero required passing an exam. But when Nejire asked her classmates, she'd heard a dozen different explanations that each of them heard from their parents. Still, Shunchan wasn't the type to lie for no reason. And none of the answers actually contradicted each other. So Nejire made an executive decision. Just do everything. It'll probably be fun anyways. And honestly, didn't the idea of a dojo where you bowed before training and swung swords and shot bows around sound so cool? "Some dojos are expensive," Ishin said plainly. "Do you even have the money?" "Yeah. I've been saving my allowance and I definitely have enough." Nejire nodded. She'd actually thought about it. Her piggy bank was pretty full after all. It wasn't like her dad skimped on her allowance when she helped around the house. "It's definitely not enough," Ishin complained in his head. But at least she considered the pricing. "What about time?" he tried again. "Don't you still have to study?" "I'll just work harder," Nejire said. "Don't I have you to help me?" She smiled at him. While I don't mind, she surprisingly actually put a decent amount of thought into this. "You know that you probably can't give." "I'll never give up," Nejire declared with confidence as she said that statement, her hands on her hips. "If you insist," Ishin sighed. "Sure." Even if he didn't particularly enjoy exercising or committing to things like this, it would probably be easier with a human-shaped motivator beside him. The purpose of the questions were if Nejire had actually put any thought into what sounded like an impulsive move. It was more of a habit than anything, seeing as if Nejire had put this much effort into trying to convince Ishin, it meant she was correspondingly going to invest that much into that action. Even if she'd sounded like she'd forgotten their promise to become heroes, asking her classmates for their perspectives meant she hadn't forgotten at all. She just wanted something more. Now that he thought about it, oversimplifying the entire process of becoming a pro-hero into just passing an entrance exam probably reduced any pressure that Nejire might have had on becoming a hero. "Nice. Then you can convince Auntie Keiko and Mom, right?" Nejire asked. "Was this your purpose this entire time?" Hey. So, it led to this scenario where Nejire had smoothly passed the responsibility over to Ishin. "Well, since Nejire and I are going to be pro-heroes in the future," Ishin began. Yep, Nejire chimed in. "And the foundation." "What's Nejire?" Ishin said flatly. "If you interrupt me one more time, I'm going to flick you on the forehead." Ignoring the amused looks from both parents, Ishin continued. "And the foundation of hero work is, at the very least, being physically fit." He finished. Keiko hummed thoughtfully. "So you're fully committed?" Both Nejire and Ishin nodded. Shirori added gently, "Even if it's for your dreams, we'll need more reasons than just wanting to work out. You don't have to necessarily join a dojo to do that." "It's also about learning the basics in a supervised environment," Ishin replied. "While I'm confident in my ability to help Nejire train, knowledge without experience can lead to bad habits. And I'm still a child myself." Nejire hadn't even considered that angle, but she nodded along anyway, full of faith in Shunchan's ability to convince both Auntie Keiko and her mom. Shirori hummed to herself. What she didn't say out loud was that she trusted Ishin with Nejire, more than Ishin himself would probably expect. After all, watching him chase after Nejire during their hero training, making sure he was always positioned to catch her as she flew around without hesitation and glee, had steadily built that trust. It would have been strange if it hadn't. What Shirori didn't want was to burden Ishin with even more responsibility, especially if he'd been dragged into it by her daughter's enthusiasm. So, even if only to lessen the weight on Ishin's shoulders, she found herself agreeing with his proposal. Money had never been the issue. What kind of parents would Keiko and Shirori be if they weren't willing to support their children's dreams? Of course, even with precognition, Ishin couldn't read minds. So he waited quietly for an answer from either parent. Keiko, meanwhile, had arrived at a similar conclusion. She'd nearly agreed from the start, if only because she wanted to see her son go outside for reasons other than school. Whenever she asked Ishin whether he'd made friends, the conversation tended to derail awkwardly. Even if I hope you and Nejire-chan get together someday, that doesn't mean she should be your only friend, she often thought. It wasn't like she could force her son's decisions. But that didn't mean she wanted to be a bad mother. When Ishin was younger, she'd been deeply career-driven. Confident in his intelligence and maturity, she'd maintained her workload, often leaving him home alone. It had been an unspoken agreement of sorts. Then one day, Ishin had casually asked her if she wanted to have dinner at Nejire-chan's house the day they moved in. That unfamiliar feeling of her son announcing something had been a wake-up call. After that, she'd turned down several promotion offers and increased her remote work, just to spend more time with him. And in doing so, she'd realized how much she hadn't known before. What he liked to eat. How he spent his free time. How considerate he was to both her and Genzai and the Hado family. She was proud of the person her son had grown into. But knowing that she'd missed so much of it weighed heavily on her. After talking it over with Genzai, they'd both shifted to working remotely whenever possible, only leaving home when absolutely necessary. Even so, given Ishin's preference for independence, simply being able to watch him and support him and his friend and see them grow into kind, thoughtful people felt like a blessing. So, after several seconds of silence, Nejire had clearly reached the limit of her patience. The two mothers nodded at the same time. Nejire immediately lit up with excitement, while Ishin allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "We did it, Shunchan!" Nejire exclaimed, shaking Ishin excitedly. Ishin, meanwhile, could only deadpan internally. "We? You speaking French?" That was all me. "So, any preferences?" Keiko asked, already pulling out her phone to look up nearby places where the kids could exercise. "Not really," Ishin replied. Oh. I want to learn how to swing a sword. And maybe shoot a bow. And I also want to. Only one thing, Nejire-chan, Shirori cut in gently. Nejire pouted in disappointment before turning to Ishin expectantly. After all, he was the smartest person she knew. "Why are you looking at me? I didn't even know this was happening today." Something that built coordination and endurance and wasn't especially dangerous would probably be best. While most martial arts helped with coordination, Ishin placed extra emphasis on endurance, keeping Nejire's stamina-based quirk firmly in mind. With his phone out, Ishin quickly skimmed through various martial arts and their distances from both school and home. To an outside observer, it probably looked like he was rapidly switching tabs without really reading anything. After narrowing it down to a few options, Ishin could smoothly remove any options that made no sense. Sumo out. Boxing out. Kendo out. Aikido in? What about Aikido? Ishin proposed. Without even knowing what Aikido even was, Nejire nodded along enthusiastically. Both parents began looking it up themselves, comparing schedules, class lengths, and logistics as they quietly discussed it. Once she grew bored of their adult conversation, Nejire tugged Ishin by the hand and turned on the TV, flipping to the latest hero news and excitedly gushing over all the cool features and quirks. "Someday," she said, completely certain, "that's gonna be me and you," habitually tugging on Ishin's sleeve. Ishin glanced at her. "Someday." Chapter 10, Childhood 9. Ishin lay on his bed after finishing his bath, staring up at the ceiling. It had been a few weeks since he and Nejire had decided to start attending a nearby Aikido dojo. As a result, his daily routine had settled into a simple loop: school, dojo, then home. It wasn't an especially demanding schedule, but for someone who had done very little exercise since being reborn into this world, it was still exhausting in its own way. Nejire, on the other hand, had thrown herself into Aikido with the same enthusiasm she applied to almost everything. Even though it lacked the swordplay or archery she'd initially imagined, she adapted quickly. With the combination of boundless energy and relentless curiosity, she took to the dojo like a fish to water. Ishin's progress was average if one was being generous. At the very least, he met the baseline physical fitness expected of a 6-year-old, enough to keep up with Nejire when she dragged him around during their free time. That alone was an achievement. While his physical prowess left much to be desired, precognition made up for it to an extent. Even then, using precognition still required the physical ability to act on what it showed him. The downside of getting home later, however, was that it left him with far less time to experiment with his teleportation. Having a mother with a retrocognition quirk and a father with a hypercognition quirk made secrecy difficult. Even casual inconsistencies had a way of being noticed, whether his parents meant to pry or not. Tonight, though, both of them had been called away unexpectedly for work. That rare absence gave Ishin the opening he needed. Lying flat on his bed, he focused on his usual test subject, a simple wooden pencil. With a thought, it vanished from his desk and reappeared above his palm. Nejire wasn't around and, more importantly, she had no way of catching him in the act. Without knowing when his parents would return, Ishin only really had one experiment. He wanted to know whether he could teleport only half of an object. Or more specifically, only teleport one part of an object. Normally, teleportation treated an object as a single unified entity, which made the calculations much more simplistic. If the Esper perceived it as one thing, the personal reality followed that interpretation and moved the entire object intact as one entity. It was why when Ishin teleported, he didn't have to consider whether he would turn out completely naked, as he considered the entirety of himself, clothes included, as one entity to teleport. But what if the object was mentally defined as two separate entities? Not broken physically, but conceptually segmented through precise spatial calculations. He already had a concept using the formula for the teleportation domain, and all he had to do was experiment. That was surprisingly easier than I thought. However, in his attempt to conceptualize different entities, Ishin ended up taking a completely different approach than he'd originally planned, something closer to a plan C. Rather than forcing himself to perceive the pencil as two separate objects outright, Ishin subdivided his teleportation domain itself. He created smaller zones of influence within the larger spatial field, defining everything inside each zone as a single object for the purposes of teleportation. And from that area of influence, Ishin could filter out specific parts based on conditions such as molecule density. The blunt end of the pencil rested in his hand. The sharpened tip sat on the table several feet away. Both halves had perfectly smooth cross-sections, as if they'd been cut by an impossibly precise blade. Ishin nodded, quietly satisfied. Now for the second experiment. Even before today's opportunity, he'd thought through several theoretical approaches to splitting a single entity. Reassembly, however, presented far fewer options. There was really only one viable method. If teleportation produced a cross-section with virtually no material loss and negligible error, then in theory bringing the two halves back together exactly should restore the object. Not gluing it together. Not even splicing it. But placing the two halves so precisely that, at an atomic level, the structure would register as continuous, convincing reality itself that the pencil had never been split to begin with. That meant overlapping the endpoints as closely as possible without causing interference. After carefully registering the dimensions of both halves in his mind, Ishin activated his teleportation. For a brief moment, the pencil appeared whole. Then it fell apart. Both halves clattered to the floor. Did it ever actually reconnect? Ishin picked up the pencils and analyzed the dimensions again, before realizing something that he should have thought about from the beginning. There's no way my senses can truly perceive the microscopic scale. No matter how exact his calculations were, the data he worked with still came from human perception and his enhanced senses. His spatial awareness right now had limits, which introduced a margin of error far smaller than what his senses could detect, but was unfortunately large enough to matter at the atomic level. So he had to account for the margin of error his senses would return from him. He exhaled slowly. So it's trial and error then. The real danger wasn't undershooting the alignment, but rather it was overshooting it. If the two halves overlapped even slightly, the result wouldn't be a clean reconnection but molecular splicing. That would permanently alter the object, even if the loss or distortion was invisible to the naked eye. Which meant he had to proceed carefully. Extremely carefully. He'd need to adjust the placement in increments so small they bordered on the limits of what he could consciously calculate, slowly refining the result step by step until the margin of error disappeared. Ishin stared down at the pencil halves. This was going to take a while. Time passed with no progress in sight. After a while, Ishin got sick of staring at the exact same pencil over and over again. I'll do this later when I actually have time, or when I'm motivated. In the end, he spliced the two broken ends together. Throwing it out just because it had snapped in half felt like a waste of money. He'd barely set the pencil down when Ishin made his way to the window, pulling back the curtains and opening it just in time to catch the small pebble Nejire tossed from her own room. At the sight of his face, she beamed brightly and held up a cup phone, waving it around with unmistakable excitement. This method of communication had come about a week ago, around 2 weeks into their training. Nejire had complained about not having a phone while they walked to the dojo after school, lamenting how everyone in her class had one except her. The complaint had lasted practically the entire day, continuing even after dinner. She'd tried to rope Ishin into helping her convince her mom, to no avail. Then, one evening, Nejire had flown up to Ishin's window and intruded into his room like usual, where she caught a glimpse of his computer screen, where it showed an anime he'd been peacefully watching. In it, two friends communicated from a distance using two cups connected by a string. Nejire didn't know what it was exactly, but it had to be some kind of communication device. Naturally, she asked her designated dictionary. Hey, Shunchan. What's that? She asked, pointing at the paused screen. A cup phone. Cup phone? Nejire tilted her head. But it definitely had the word phone in it. The novelty of the idea completely enthralled her. She convinced Ishin to make one, promising she'd decorate it in return. Even if Nejire normally flew up to Ishin's room, it probably wouldn't be great if her mom eventually found out. She already knew. Because of the phone's simplicity and Nejire's insistence on using it consistently, she managed to convince her parents to switch rooms to a larger one directly across from Ishin's. From there, they could see each other's windows clearly. And thus, the Blueberry Vanilla Phone MK.1 was born. Nejire's cup was covered in drawings of blueberries. Ishin's featured vanilla ice cream and vanilla flowers. Ishin went along with it partly because he felt bad for her and partly because he appreciated the sheer novelty of it. Who cared if it was childish? These were the kinds of things that only worked when you were young. So, starting about a week ago when Nejire was extremely bored, or it was late and she had to go home, they'd have these call sessions. With her easily bored personality, they happened often. The conversations ranged from future hero careers to homework help, mostly on Nejire's end. They were currently on Blueberry Vanilla Phone MK.2, after Shirori pointed out that speaking and listening into the same cup for several days straight was unsanitary. After Nejire was convinced to replace the cups, Shirori and Keiko came up with the idea that Ishin and Nejire keep the original cups, after disinfecting, of the other's design with sly smiles on their faces. Nejire had quickly agreed, and Ishin didn't have much of a reason to disagree either. So, on a nearly empty bookshelf, aside from some manga and elementary-level textbooks, sat a white paper cup with clumsily drawn blueberries and blue flowers. On a similar shelf in Nejire's room was a cup decorated with equally clumsy vanilla ice cream and vanilla flowers. After Shirori and Keiko's suggestion, Nejire had insisted that they decorate each other's cups instead of her doing both. Finally, with Nejire being the one who was the most enthusiastic one about the cup phones, she was the one who held the phones, initiating conversations. That was how this method of communication came to be. Ishin watched with barely concealed amusement as Nejire aimed, closing one eye and sticking an arm out for balance. Their windows were only about 7 meters apart, which meant Nejire missing wasn't exactly rare. But Ishin, ever lazy, simply teleported the cup if it came close enough to be ambiguous from a distance, just like today. His precognition told him it would miss his range by exactly an inch. So he teleported it into his hand at the last second. Judging by Nejire's proud stance, hands on her hips with an even brighter smile on her face, it seemed she hadn't noticed. Ishin put his ear to the cup. "Shunchan." Her whisper carried through the string. He lowered the cup and looked at her. Nejire stared back expectantly, clearly waiting for him to respond properly. With a sigh, he whispered back. "What?" "Mom got a call from Auntie Keiko and they probably won't be back until really late. So she told me to ask if you want to eat dinner at our house." "Sure, he said after a moment of consideration. Okay. See you later. Yeah. See you later. Ishin tossed the cup back. Even though his throw was slightly off, Nejire quickly reeled it in using the string, making it look like he'd nailed it on the first try. She waved happily but didn't leave the window. Ishin sighed inwardly. She's probably not going to leave until I do. Chapter 11, Childhood 10. Ishin stared at the cup that had just glitched, or at least that was the closest word he had for what he'd seen. Maybe I should have expected this, he thought. My computation speed has increased, and so has the theoretical range of my teleportation. His AIM diffusion field had progressed to the point where it was no longer just an abstract phenomenon. It was actively, visibly interfering with the space around him. When ROB had explained things during his reincarnation, it had mentioned that Ishin would gain an AIM diffusion field alongside Shirai Kuriko's personal reality. At the time, Ishin hadn't given it much thought, but now that it was becoming noticeable, he couldn't exactly ignore it anymore. If this continued, he'd eventually need a plausible explanation for why objects around him were behaving strangely. And if there was one thing Ishin hated, it was anything that wasted his time or made things unnecessarily complicated. The only reason he'd caught the cup blinking in and out of place was because of his precognition. Without that, the distortion was so brief that anyone watching would have just assumed they'd blinked or lost focus for a split second. Still, Ishin knew the truth. The stronger his personal reality became, the more obvious these glitches would get. At least there was one small aspect that didn't make it too bad. Because he wasn't actively teleporting the cup, touching or moving it mid-glitch didn't cause any accidental splicing. He didn't even want to imagine what it would feel like for a person to get caught in one of those distortions. If his ability ever affected someone nearby, specifically someone he cared about, and hurt them. He shut that line of thought down immediately. He wouldn't allow that to happen. Which meant he needed to figure this out before the problem grew beyond his control. Less than 10 minutes later, Ishin was back in his room, but this time with a rhinoceros beetle he'd found near the house. So now all I have to do is wait until the beetle glitches, he muttered. As long as the beetle didn't die and didn't start moving erratically afterward, the test would be good enough for his purposes. After only a few seconds, though, Ishin abandoned that approach. It wasn't like he could consciously control his AIM diffusion field in the first place. Instead of waiting for it to happen, might as well try to understand the mechanics of the glitching. Distance and timing were the most important factors. After a few seconds of thought, Ishin pieced together a basic framework for how the glitching worked. First, the range affected by the glitches didn't correlate with his teleportation domain, nor with the theoretical maximum distance he could teleport, both of which increased passively over time. Instead, it seemed to be governed by an entirely separate system, the development of his personal reality. That alone made it annoyingly difficult to quantify. For now, the effect extended to a maximum radius of roughly 8 meters, and it only affected inanimate objects. The interval between glitches ranged from a minimum of 2 minutes to a maximum of 7. Ishin hypothesized that as his personal reality advanced, these parameters would change, where either the time between glitches would shorten or the range of affected targets would expand. Unfortunately, even after waiting far longer than expected, the rhinoceros beetle remained in its makeshift enclosure without any visible changes. Strangely enough, that lack of results was information in itself. It raised the possibility that living creatures, people included, weren't affected by the glitching at all. If that turned out to be true, it would be a huge relief. Or, just as likely, Ishin was simply having a streak of bad luck, and the glitch had skipped over the beetle for no particular reason at all. Ishin eventually pushed the issue to the back of his mind when it became clear that nothing else was happening anytime soon. As he reached to turn on his computer, a faint, instinctive sense of unease washed over him. He sighed under his breath. Then, as if on autopilot, he walked over to the window and opened it. Waiting outside was the familiar face of his ever-energetic neighbor, Hado Nejire. He easily caught the pebble she tossed at his window and was immediately met with her bright, excited smile. Judging by the way she was practically vibrating in place, she had a lot to say, probably because she'd just returned from her annual health checkup. That was the only reason she hadn't come by sooner, since Nejire usually stuck to Ishin like glue outside of school and sleep. Nejire didn't even wait before throwing the cup, which was getting more accurate as time passed, even if technically she barely missed, even if the outcome didn't show that. Ever since Ishin had started teleporting Nejire's near-miss paper cup into his hand, it had sparked an idea for a potential future technique. If he could reduce the delay between teleports, for example, reach 30 to 60 activations per second, he could create subtle but deliberate trajectories by teleporting the movement itself faster than the naked eye could track. At present, for simple motions like tossing a ball into the air and back down, his limit was about 15 frames per second. With the cup now in hand, Ishin lifted the cup to his ear, listening as Nejire launched into a rambling recap of her day without Ishin. Hey, Shunchan, did you know that girls grow faster than boys? What a weird start to a conversation, but sure. Yeah? I thought I'd stump you, she whined. Then do you know why girls grow faster than boys? Ishin asked. Nope. Why? Nejire answered immediately, curiosity winning out her intention of trying to stump Ishin. Well, basically. Ishin froze. Ishin tensed for a split second before he inwardly sighed and then complained inwardly. However, this sudden pause caused Nejire to visibly tilt her head in confusion. Shunchan? Huh? Oh, sorry. In 5 seconds, Nejire was going to glitch. He'd felt it coming through precognition and had instinctively prepared to teleport himself away if anything went wrong, secret be damned. But nothing happened. No injuries. No changes. Relief flooded through him at the information. Then irritation followed soon after her safety was known. 4 hours, he thought bitterly. 4 hours and the beetle stays perfectly fine, but the moment I start talking to Nejire. What kind of shitty luck was this? But after knowing that Nejire wouldn't be injured due to his AIM diffusion field, all his worries regarding accidentally injuring someone fizzled out. So anyway, Ishin continued, girls grow. Shunchan? He tensed again, then relaxed just as quickly. I just saw a super cool world. Nejire gushed. Like, I blinked and suddenly everything was rainbow-colored. Yeah? Yeah. Ishin's eyebrow twitched, but not at her enthusiasm, but at the sheer absurdity of the situation. Because 5 seconds later, Nejire glitched again. Shunchan? It happened again. Ha, Ishin sighed. Such misfortune. Chapter 12, Childhood 11. While the glitching was basically invisible unless you were actively paying attention, Ishin had 2 parents whose quirks enhanced their cognitive abilities. So it wasn't surprising that, only a few days later, he found himself sitting across from them, both wearing expressions of quiet concern. Keiko started the conversation. I know I give you a surprising amount of freedom when it comes to your life, she said gently, but that doesn't mean I don't care about you. I know. So, she continued, folding her hands together, do you have any idea about the events happening around you? Ishin's first thought was, how can you tell it has something to do with me? Not even a second later, he wanted to smack himself in the forehead. With 2 extremely observant parents, it would have been impossible for them not to notice the glitching. He'd already considered that. What he hadn't considered was the fact that he was just as perceptive, if not more so, when it came to cognition. His complete lack of reaction to the glitching had, in itself, been a reaction. It basically told them he already knew about it and didn't say anything. Genzai and Keiko noticed the shift in his expression and assumed he'd either figured it out on his own or confirmed it through his quirk. Ishin sighed inwardly. He did hide his teleportation abilities, but he did so casually. Mostly because he couldn't be bothered to put in real effort. He only ever did the bare minimum, especially when it came to hiding things from his parents. With Nejire, it was more about damage control, preventing a never-ending parade of questions. Even he didn't know all the possible applications of his teleportation, as he usually came up with them on the spot, then tested feasibility whenever he felt like it. Might as well tell her when he was confident enough to answer all her possible questions. As for his parents, the only active measure he took was using teleportation when they weren't home. That was it. Mainly because he didn't have a strong enough reason or motivation to spend most of his free time developing it. Teleportation, or his teleportation rather, was quite literally one of the most optimal abilities for killing. With his teleportation domain expanding to 110 meters over the past few weeks, Ishin assumed that by the time he was older, it would stretch into the kilometer range. That alone matched the effective range of most snipers. Except his teleportation couldn't miss. Even 110 meters was enough to kill without suspicion. The way to kill was even easier. A pebble embedded in the brain or heart. An instant dismantling of their body. dropping someone from a lethal height. All of these methods were basically effortless. And aside from unconsciousness, ambushing him was practically impossible thanks to his precognition. The only truly troublesome aspect was that his teleportation was too clean. If the full extent of it were ever discovered, it would be easy to trace incidents back to him. Similar to how if there was a humongous fight with an extreme amount of fire damage, most would probably attribute it to heroes like Endeavor. Of course, he could deliberately make things sloppier to emulate other quirks. But that sounded like a massive waste of time that could be spent reading fanfics or web novels. Ishin sighed, mentally running through possible explanations, but before he could speak, Genzai beat him to it. Shun-kun, he said calmly, while everyone has secrets and we both respect your space, it'd be nice if your mom and I knew something beyond the fact that you can make objects blink in and out of space. We trust that your lack of reaction means the glitching isn't dangerous, Keiko added. But it is surprising. You're still a child, she continued softly. If you're struggling with this, we just wanted you to know that we'll support you no matter what. Well, Genzai added dryly, unless you hurt someone. Keiko immediately elbowed him in the ribs. I think Shun-kun already knows that, honey, she whispered. Nah, Ishin interjected. It's not that big of a secret. And dealing with this now was less troublesome than dealing with it later. I just don't think my quirk is precognition. That caught their attention. Both Genzai and Keiko blinked. Keiko opened her mouth to speak, and Genzai gently covered it with his hand. Might as well let the kid finish. Yes, I can see a few seconds into the future, Ishin continued. That part's true. Keiko tried to speak again. Genzai kept his hand there. But I don't think that's my actual quirk. It's... Ishin paused and thought before shrugging inwardly. I was going to reveal it eventually anyways. I'll just show you. The moment he finished speaking, Ishin vanished from his chair and reappeared in the one to his right, the seat Nejire usually occupied when she came over for dinner. Teleportation? Genzai blurted out, forgetting his earlier restraint. Even his hypercognition stuttered like it just registered something that made no sense. No change in mass, no distortion in space, just his son was in his chair one moment and the next he wasn't. Keiko's eyes widened as she replayed the moment in her head through retrocognition, scrutinizing every detail. Well, Ishin said, yes. But also not really. He teleported a notebook and pencil from his room into his hands, ignoring their renewed shock. Ishin quickly wrote down his personalized 11th dimensional formula. It wasn't like it gave them any advantage against him and they were family. Keiko leaned in. Linear algebra? Genzai wasn't as mathematically inclined as his wife, but even he grasped enough to follow. Yeah, Ishin nodded. Using that formula and sensory input, I can teleport. The formula itself wasn't especially complex, just incredibly tedious. Parameter management actually took more time than the actual calculation. But even when I'm not doing anything, Ishin continued, gesturing pointedly at Genzai, I'm still passively gathering information. Genzai and Keiko nodded in understanding. So I think my brain's passive state uses something similar to Laplace's demon, Ishin said. That's what you interpret as precognition. Keiko immediately nodded, understanding the concept. Genzai didn't fully get it, but the gist was clear enough. I see. Keiko murmured thoughtfully. And the glitching you've noticed is probably an involuntary movement from the actual quirk, which is letting me apply formulas to reality. Ishin finished. Keiko didn't ask any follow-up questions, despite the obvious curiosity burning behind her eyes. She was simply grateful he'd shared this much. A spatial type ability like teleportation was a heavily monitored quirk. And knowing her son's I don't want trouble personality, she knew he could have easily given a half-truth and she would have believed it. That he trusted them enough to be honest made her genuinely happy. So, Genzai said after a moment, you're still planning to keep your quirk registered as precognition? While it wasn't exactly legal to not change a quirk's classification in the registry when they knew about it, they could always claim they hadn't known their son could teleport if an unlikely public reveal ever occurred. Nah, Ishin replied. Just change it to something vague. Like personal reality. He couldn't be bothered to make a new name. I just don't have to display teleportation abilities, but if I do, I can just say it's a side effect. Genzai looked at Ishin with an exasperated expression. Now this was his son. Changing the quirk classification meant dealing with paperwork, which was indeed time-consuming and bothersome. But if Ishin ever got caught teleporting under the new label, there would be far fewer questions afterward. A lazy genius, was what Genzai had to say about his son. So, Keiko said, her tone turning mischievous. How are you planning to reveal this to Nejire-chan? She smiled knowingly. Knowing Nejire, learning about teleportation would only skyrocket her already absurd enthusiasm for becoming heroes together. Not that she needs the encouragement, seeing as her motivation to be heroes with Shunkuin is already sky-high, Keiko thought fondly. Just let her figure it out on her own, Ishin said with a shrug. And I'd appreciate it if you two didn't casually mention it, he added. You know her personality. That earned a long inward sigh from Keiko. At this rate, would she ever get to see a grandchild with such a passive son? Chapter 13, Childhood 12. After that conversation, nothing really changed for the Shunkan family. If anything, they were even more casual and closer than before. If there was a change, it was that Ishin could now casually practice and use his teleportation at home. And now that teleporting was an option, there really wasn't much reason for him to move around at all. Before, he had to go downstairs to grab juice and then come back up. Now he could just teleport the carton straight into his hand, pour it into a glass, and teleport it back. How convenient. Genzai had noted that the conversation had only enabled Ishin to become even lazier than usual, a sentiment Keiko wholeheartedly agreed with. Keiko was even more grateful to Nejire now, because while Ishin used to leave his room to do chores or handle small tasks, he now only emerged if Nejire called for him, or if they had to leave for school or the dojo. With the sole exception of going out to buy snacks. Shunchan, should we get melon-flavored popsicles or wasabi-flavored popsicles? And what a coincidence, it seemed Nejire was already at the convenience store at the same time Ishin had decided ice cream was a perfectly acceptable snack. With the weather warming up and summer break approaching, it felt justified. Ishin inwardly recoiled at the second option. Why does that even exist? Unfortunately, his thoughts and his mouth were in sync. Why does that even exist? Obviously the melon-flavored ones. Ishin reached into the freezer and grabbed his usual choice, vanilla, before something else caught his eye. A summer special blueberry vanilla ice cream, only available for 3 weeks? That actually sounded good. While Nejire had enthusiastically named their future team Blueberry Vanilla, neither of them had ever actually eaten blueberry vanilla ice cream. It wasn't a common flavor in convenience stores, blueberry cheesecake usually took its place instead. After quickly calculating the amount of money in his small wallet and deciding it was worth it, Ishin took one of the blueberry vanilla ice creams as well. Blueberry vanilla? Nejire echoed, peering at the unfamiliar wrapper before reaching in and grabbing one herself, only to put both the melon and wasabi popsicles down. Why'd you even ask about melon or wasabi if you weren't going to choose either? Ishin deadpanned. Hey, Nejire grinned, giving him a completely thoughtless smile. Your ice cream just looked tastier. We can just share if you're curious, Ishin said, gesturing toward the ice cream she'd dropped. Oh yeah. Nejire slapped her forehead. She bent down and picked up both the melon and wasabi popsicles. Both? I hope you know that if you eat the wasabi one and don't like it, I'm not finishing it for you. That stopped her cold. Nejire hesitated, then sheepishly put the wasabi-flavored popsicle back. Maybe eating her vegetables for her has been enabling this, Ishin mused. Now that I think about it, Nejire, I won't eat your vegetables anymore. What? Nejire whipped her head toward him at lightning speed. After hurriedly apologizing to the cashier for the sudden outburst and paying for their ice cream, Nejire followed him outside. Why? Ishin sat down on a nearby bench beside a small park, really just a square patch of grass where elderly people gathered for radio calisthenics in the mornings. Because, Ishin began calmly, it isn't healthy to not eat vegetables. Ah, Nejire dragged the sound out dramatically, shoulders slumping as she plopped down beside him. But they're bitter sometimes. And you always eat them like it's nothing. That's because they're food, Ishin replied flatly as he peeled open his vanilla ice cream. That's not convincing at all, Nejire puffed her cheeks, poking at her melon popsicle before taking a bite. Her eyes immediately lit up. Oh. This one's really good. Ishin hummed in acknowledgement, already halfway through his vanilla. The blueberry vanilla ice cream remained unopened in his other hand. Are you saving that one for later? She asked. Maybe. He glanced at it. It's limited edition. If it's good, I'll buy more next time. Nejire leaned closer, squinting at the wrapper with intense focus. Can I have a bite? Ishin didn't answer right away. He finished his mouthful, then peeled open the blueberry vanilla and held it out toward her. Sure, go ahead. Only one bite though. I'll be gentle. Nejire promised immediately. I don't know how one's supposed to be gentle with ice cream, but sure. She took a bite, then froze. Oh. Her eyes widened. Oh. Shunchan, this is really good. I know. How did you know? I read the label. If it's a limited edition, it has to be somewhat decent. That's normal marketing tactics. That's amazing. She stared at the ice cream with open envy before reluctantly leaning back. Maybe I should have gotten that one instead. Ishin took a bite himself, satisfied. Nejire sighed contentedly, swinging her legs. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence as a light breeze passed through the park. Hey, Shunchan, Nejire said suddenly. My mom said we're going back to Akita during the break to visit my grandparents. Ishin paused, ice cream halfway to his mouth before continuing to eat. And? Well, she hesitated. I wanted to ask if you wanted to come too. Why? I don't even know your grandparents. Ishin thought. Why? Because we'll be separated for a whole month? Saying it out loud only made her more downcast. Back then, when she lived in an old-timer neighborhood without kids her age, a month apart wouldn't have mattered. But now, being separated from her bestest friend for the longest time so far felt depressing. She had asked her mom if Ishin and his family were going as well. Shirori had shaken her head, echoing Ishin's own thought. Why invite a friend to visit your grandparents? Shirori gently explained that the Shunkan family probably had their own plans, and that it wouldn't be right to intrude on another family's vacation. Feeling deflated, Nejire had gone out to get ice cream to cheer herself up, only to spot Ishin entering the convenience store shortly after. Her mood had instantly brightened. And now, remembering why she'd gone out in the first place, she decided to take her chance. Nejire looked at Ishin nervously as he hummed in thought, finishing the last bite of his blueberry vanilla. I've lived in this neighborhood my whole life, Ishin reflected. And my parents have never mentioned extended family once. So either they're dead or we're estranged. Ishin wasn't particularly attached to vacations. All he really needed was entertainment, food, and a place to sleep. A remarkably low-maintenance human. If going with Nejire made her happy and he didn't care either way, then why not? Well, maybe I might be a bit lonely. Ishin added. His bigger concern was what the Hado family would think, letting their daughter's friend tag along on a family trip. Even if the two families were close enough to eat together 4 or 5 times a week. Keiko and Genzai probably wouldn't mind, as his shut-in habits had exacerbated after the teleportation talks. If anything, they'd be more worried about inconveniencing the Hado family than about Ishin himself. Well, Ishin finally said, glancing at Nejire's half-hopeful, half-puppy-eyed expression. I don't really care if I go. Yay, but you'll have to convince my parents. Ah, well, what did she expect? A top-class lawyer and a first-class friend? He wasn't going to do everything for her just 'cause she was his friend. Chapter 14, Childhood 13. So, Nejire-chan, you're asking if my Shunkuin can go with you to Akita Prefecture over summer break? Keiko rubbed her chin in mock seriousness, flicking a glance at Ishin's deadpan expression. Well, if Shunkuin isn't saying anything, she mused, then this was probably Nejire-chan's idea like usual. It felt strange not to have Ishin be the one trying to convince her. Still, Keiko merely shrugged inwardly before turning her attention back to Nejire's determined face. Yeah, Nejire nodded rapidly. Ishin had told her to try convincing his parents herself, but in practice she'd practically begged him for advice beforehand. Her original argument had been that they'd be apart for a whole month. While that would probably tug at Keiko's and Genzai's heartstrings, it didn't guarantee anything. So now, armed with the tutorial AI Ishin, Nejire was ready to make her case. On the other hand, Keiko was already calculating how many vacation days she could squeeze out of her schedule to follow along. She hadn't had siblings or even parents growing up, which was one of the main reasons she'd poured herself so completely into her career before having Ishin. Genzai had lived a similar life, which was why the two of them had grown close despite choosing such different paths. Because of that, their usual vacation options like visiting parents were non-existent. And given their shared pasts, vacation had usually just meant staying home and resting, with no experience with any traveling. Now that an opportunity had finally presented itself, why wouldn't she take it? Akita seemed pretty safe too. And Nejire-chan will probably bring Shunkuin everywhere. That mental image alone was something to look forward to. Still, Nejire's expression told her this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment whim. She'd clearly put thought into it. So why not let her play it out? Why do you want to bring Shunkuin with you to Akita? Keiko asked. She interlaced her fingers and rested her chin on her hands, the imaginary glint of her non-existent glasses flashing with exaggerated interest. Faced with Keiko's uncharacteristically serious expression, Nejire gulped nervously. She instinctively glanced at Ishin for support, then snapped her gaze back forward. No. I have to do this without Shunchan's help. If I lean on Shunchan, where will my big sister authority go? She chanted to herself, mustering her courage. Ishin watched Nejire's expression shift from anxious to determined and shot his mother an exasperated look. Why are you making this difficult? Keiko naturally ignored him, her focus entirely on Nejire. Nejire-chan? She didn't notice that just before Nejire spoke, Ishin stared at her in confusion, then dragged a hand down his face in resignation. Shunchan promised that we'd be partners for life. Nejire slapped the tabletop with absolute sincerity. No, where did this come from? Ishin blinked, completely dumbfounded. Let it be known, Ishin had recommended that Nejire say that since he only left the house usually because of Nejire's insistence, go down that route, not, whatever this was. Keiko froze. The room went quiet in a very specific, dangerous way, like the calm right before someone decided whether they were amused or deeply invested. Partners? Keiko repeated slowly. She turned her head toward Ishin, a teasing smile creeping onto her face. For life? Just to clarify, Ishin started, only to be cut off. Oh. Keiko tilted her head, eyes narrowing. So you didn't promise Nejire-chan something like that? Ishin opened his mouth again. It was never. Nejire, meanwhile, leaned forward, brimming with confidence she absolutely did not feel 5 seconds ago, interrupting him outright. Yep. Partners, she said brightly. Like no matter what. Through hero work, school, and, life stuff. We're the Blueberry Vanilla Duo. Nejire added. Ishin threw his hands into the air in exasperation. How the hell am I supposed to explain if I don't even get a chance to speak? So basically. But Keiko had already stopped listening to him. She knew the truth from his reaction alone, but really, why pass up the chance to tease Nejire-chan? Her gaze returned to Nejire, one eyebrow lifting in curiosity. And what does partners for life mean to you, Nejire-chan? She asked gently. Nejire stiffened. Maybe this wasn't how it's supposed to go. Her eyes darted sideways toward Ishin for half a second before she caught herself. No. Independent argument. Completely forgetting that she'd begged Ishin for advice before coming over, Nejire had fully derailed his entire plan. Well. She straightened up, hands planted on the table. It means we look out for each other. Train together, work together, eat together. Ishin winced. And if one of us is in trouble, the other shows up no matter what, she finished proudly. Keiko blinked once. Then she smiled, not the teasing smile she'd intended, not even a playful one. But a fond one. Shunkuin is a lucky boy. That sounds very serious, Keiko said, nodding slowly. Ishin stared at his mother in mild horror. That was not a legally binding statement, he said quickly, just in case. So, Akita, she continued, steering the conversation with suspicious ease. Is this about spending time together? Or is there something specific you want to do there? Nejire relaxed just a bit. This is what Shunchan talked about. Oh. Both, she chirped. My family's there and there are hot springs and mountains and I wanted to show Shunchan where I grew up. I talk about it all the time, but it's different if he actually sees it, right? She paused, then added more softly, and I don't like the idea of being away from him for that long. Ishin slapped a hand over his face. What are you doing? Keiko noticed Nejire's hesitation, her gaze softening further. I see, she said quietly. She leaned back in her chair, tapping a finger against the table in thought. Ishin just wanted this entire shit show of a conversation to be over. How did a simple convincing session go this wrong? Nejire clasped her hands together under the table, practically vibrating. After a long moment, Keiko sighed. Well, she said, I can't decide this on my own. You haven't asked your mom about this either, right? That got Nejire's attention. I forgot I haven't even told my mom. She even said not to disturb Shunchan's family. A chill ran down her spine. We'll talk it over as a family, Keiko continued. But Nejire-chan. Nejire snapped to attention, her nervousness still there. I appreciate you being honest, Keiko said warmly. And brave enough to say all that without Shunkuen helping. Nejire beamed. Ishin groaned softly and buried his face in his hands. I'm never letting her prepare an argument again. Chapter 15, Childhood 14. So, here I am in Akita. Ishin leaned against the side of the small, old-fashioned Japanese truck, the engine rattling steadily beneath him as cool wind rushed past. The air smelled faintly of grass and soil, with a hint of fertilizer carried in from the nearby fields. He looked out at a view that would probably make the average Japan glazer lose their mind over the aesthetics. The classic Japanese countryside, which honestly kind of looked like any other countryside. Nejire, on the other hand, was half leaning over the truck bed, pointing excitedly at everything they passed. That hill there? I used to sled it down during winter. And that field? There's so many frogs at night. Oh. And that's the path that leads to never mind, I'll just show you later. It seems this vacation only made her more hyper, Ishin thought. It's more hilly than I thought. But then again, it is Akita. The village itself was a flat farming settlement, but it was hemmed in by mountains on both sides, with only a single, slightly out-of-the-way road leading in and out. So what do you think? Nejire asked, sliding back to his side, her eyes shining as she waited for his opinion. Well, if there was one undeniably good thing about the countryside, it was probably the air, right? I guess the air is kind of nice? Ishin shrugged. Nejire froze for a moment, then puffed out her cheeks dramatically. That's it? You're supposed to talk about the view, not the air. The view is nice too. Ishin added belatedly. That doesn't sound sincere at all, she said, leaning closer, clearly trying to peer into his face for a reaction. Caught. Hey. He wasn't really upset about Nejire's outburst back then about being partners for life. She was young, and with the pressure his mom had unintentionally put on her, something like that happening wasn't surprising. What was mildly troublesome were the even weirder looks their parents had started giving them afterward, especially whenever he and Nejire played together before summer break. It felt less like concern and more like they were watching some painfully sweet romance drama unfold in real time. Nejire had gotten a spanking when she went home that day, but she seemed to have accepted that outcome as long as it meant she could still get Ishin to come visit during summer vacation. Not long after, Keiko had apparently explained Nejire's little stunt to Shirori, who then rather enthusiastically agreed to the Shunkan family's sudden vacation plans despite Nejire's punishment. Unfortunately, due to how tiny the population of Nejire's hometown was, there were no hotels or inns to speak of. Instead, Nejire's grandparents, who were basically regarded as the village chiefs, had generously offered to let the Shunkan family stay at their home. At the moment, Nejire and Ishin were hitching a ride with a kind neighbor to the nearest convenience store, which was a few kilometers away. It was the sort of community where everyone knew everyone else, so when Nejire spotted the neighbor earlier, she'd asked without hesitation, and he'd agreed just as easily. When Nejire said she lived in the countryside, I didn't expect this much of a countryside, Ishin thought. Looking around at the sparse traditional buildings, with no obvious hero presence or modern amenities in sight, Ishin couldn't help but wonder how Nejire had kept herself entertained before moving away. With a place like this, it almost feels like the whole future century part of the MHA world doesn't exist here. Ishin's gaze suddenly snagged on something out of place. Is that a Lawson's? A single modern convenience store stood among the traditional buildings like it had been dropped there by mistake. Oh, Shunchan, I see it. Nejire pointed excitedly as they approached the convenience store. So I wasn't imagining it. The uncle had only been headed in their general direction, so after dropping them off, he couldn't take them back. Ishin and Nejire bowed deeply and waved until he disappeared down the road. Ishin briefly glanced at the uncle's hands, which were oddly shaped, almost like chicken feet. I'm more surprised that I'm not surprised, he mused, bowing again. They walked back along the dirt path, each holding a snack they'd picked out. What should we do first? Nejire wondered aloud, practically vibrating with excitement. There were so many things she'd always wanted to show Ishin if he ever came to her hometown, and now that he was actually here, the list felt endless. The creek near her house. The abandoned shrine. Her secret hideout. So many things to introduce. Well, I came because you wanted me here, Ishin said, adjusting the too large wide-brimmed hat perched on his head. I'll just follow your lead. MHM? Then let's go to the creek first. Sure. Let's tell our parents first though. Yep. When they returned to the relatively large Hado home and stepped inside, the atmosphere immediately felt off. It was too quiet. Grandpa? Nejire called out, her voice echoing in the silence. No answer. She glanced toward the entryway and noticed several pairs of shoes missing. Huh? Nejire hurried through the house, checking room after room, her steps growing faster. Grandma? Mom? Nothing. Weird, where'd everyone go? They wouldn't leave without telling me anything. Nejire muttered, turning around to ask Ishin, only to realize he wasn't behind her. Did I move too fast? Shunchan? Where are you? She called out, panic creeping into her voice. If Shunchan was gone too, what was she supposed to do? Relax, I'm right here, Ishin replied tiredly. He was lying on the living room floor, staring up at the open courtyard, a folded note in his hand. Oh. Shunchan. Nejire rushed over and dropped beside him with a relieved sigh. You scared me. She leaned over to peer at the note. What's that? Just a note left by my mom. On the note read, Chicken. One of the nearby uncles seems to have gone missing in the mountains. Since Genzai and I wanted to help, we followed after him along with the Hado family. He apparently has frequent memory loss, so it doesn't seem too serious. If we don't return in a few hours, please call the police. That's absolutely a death flag, Ishin thought. Shunchan, we have to help. Nejire said immediately, already on her feet. Sure, Ishin replied easily. He'd been planning on helping anyway. Leaving Nejire alone wasn't an option, and as long as she stayed within a 100-meter radius of him, she couldn't really be any safer. With his newly dubbed omniscient domain, Ishin felt fairly confident. They'd only left recently, so they couldn't have gone too far. This is the debut of the Blueberry Vanilla Duo. Nejire declared excitedly as she filled 2 water bottles and handed one to Ishin. Yeah. She's not wrong. Chapter 16, Childhood 15. You know, I'm kind of regretting leaving without Shunkuin. That thought lingered in Ishin's parents' minds as they searched the mountain for the missing neighbor. With both of their quirks being well-suited for search and rescue situations, Genzai and Keiko had quickly volunteered when the Hado family organized a search party. However, not long after they began, Genzai detected unusual movement in the distance, movement that didn't match any normal human pattern. He immediately voiced his concern to the rest of the group. The rest of the search party, consisting of Nejire's parents and grandparents, brushed it off, assuming it was just a wild animal. Bears and boars weren't uncommon in these mountains after all. This was a community used to living alongside dangerous wildlife. Everyone carried bear spray, and 2 had brought a shovel for protection. While these so-called protective measures did little to reassure the Shunkan couple, there wasn't much else they could reasonably demand. It wasn't like everyone held hunting-grade weapons. The only hunter in the village with a licensed rifle lived on the opposite side of town, and there simply wasn't time to call him in before searching further. So Genzai, uneasy about the presence of a quadrupedal animal somewhere nearby, could only swallow his nerves and silently hope it wouldn't head in their direction. The missing neighbor had a mutant-type quirk that gave him deer antlers and hooves, which were features that only increased the danger if he wandered deep into the forest. Thankfully, due to repeated incidents in the past, the village, along with the neighbor's son who was frequently out due to having work in the nearby town, had agreed to attach a tracker to the man's antlers. Since the antlers had no nerves or blood vessels, it was harmless. Even if a bit unconventional, it was essentially just a piercing. With the tracker active, the real challenge was reaching him. His deer hooves made traversing steep, uneven terrain far easier for him than for any normal human. This was the main reason that Genzai and Keiko volunteered. So, with Genzai being the radar for possible wild animals and Keiko for knowing which tracks were safer, it greatly assisted the Hado family. Still, the distance was far greater than anyone had anticipated, turning the search into an impromptu hiking expedition. Keiko exercised regularly for her health and managed fine, but Genzai lagged behind, already visibly winded. With Ishin's senses that far surpassed Genzai and Keiko's along with his teleportation, this sudden hiking trip could have been nipped from the route. However, they had promised to keep his teleportation a secret. Convenience wasn't a good enough reason to break that trust. And more importantly, they were still parents. Asking a child, especially one not even of age, to shoulder the responsibility of saving a life was an unreasonable burden. That conviction, however, began to waver as time dragged on. This is weird. Hado Genji, Nejire's grandfather, stared down at the tracker on his phone, his brow furrowing. What is it? Nejire's grandmother, Hado Tomo, responded, already exasperated with how long this abrupt hiking session had gone for. Keiko had reassured everyone that they'd left a note before heading out, but Nejire was bound to worry if she came home to an empty house. Without waiting for Genji's answer, Tomo snatched the phone from his hands and frowned. How is he moving so fast? That single sentence sent a chill through all 6 members of the search party. Are you sure you're reading that right? Hado Mitsuru, Nejire's father, jogged up to her, peering at the screen. Mitsuru stared at the screen for a long second, longer than necessary. That's not human, he said quietly. His expression slowly hardened as he looked from the phone to his wife, then to Ishin's parents. We're heading back, he said with finality. We're getting old man Saburo. His voice left no room for argument as he picked up the pace as he turned around. Why? Genzai started, only to be cut off when Keiko slapped his shoulder. Think for a second, she snapped, frowning. How can an elderly man with memory loss move that fast? His quirk isn't even remotely related to speed. She grabbed Genzai's hand, fully aware of her husband's limited stamina. Without support, he'd be exhausted in minutes. While Genzai noticed her hand subconsciously shaking, he couldn't say much, as his was the same. Mitsuru's next statement only made the nervousness worse. 60 kilometers per hour, to be exact, Mitsuru added grimly. 60? Shirori exclaimed. Isn't the average for bears 40? 40 to 48, Mitsuru finished. And that speed is assuming old man Moriyama is already in its mouth. The maximum speed is likely much higher. With no one in the group possessing anything near a combat-oriented quirk, the best bet was to get assistance. Realistically, Moriyama was probably already dead by the time the tracker registered movement that fast. With speeds of 60 kilometers an hour in the mountains no less, no one present wanted to face such a creature. They turned back, increasing their pace, but they were still several hundred meters from the village, never mind the distance to old man Saburo's house. Still, there was one small silver lining. With lives at stake, Genzai decided calling for assistance, his overpowered son, was probably justified. He looked at the phone that said NO signal, hoping that eventually they would get close enough to get a signal, in which they could call in Ishin for assistance or at least faster evacuation. Keiko noticed his anxious expression immediately, glancing down at his tightened hand on his phone. Reaching for her own phone, she was about to try calling Ishin when Mitsuru suddenly froze. His face drained of color. It's coming toward us. At that exact moment, Keiko's phone flickered. 1 bar of signal. Damn, they went further than I thought. Ishin was, admittedly, cheating by teleporting whenever Nejire wasn't looking his way. That said, it wasn't like Nejire wasn't doing the same. She used her quirk to hover over especially rocky or uneven terrain, occasionally glancing back to make sure Ishin was still behind her. Every time she did, she found him keeping up without as much effort as she thought it would. So precognition can do that too, she called out cheerfully. Ishin just nodded in response, all the while keeping his omniscient domain active. At its current stage, the teleportation domain had a maximum effective radius of roughly 150 meters. Within that range, the information he received was nearly flawless. The omniscient domain extended a little farther, reaching around 160 meters with acceptable accuracy, though the data began to degrade noticeably beyond that point. Past 250 meters, the amount of information was practically non-existent. Ishin didn't bother factoring data beyond the 150-meter mark into his teleportation calculations. The margin of error simply wasn't worth it. For searching, however, the wider range was more than sufficient. By following the search party's trail, as long as they hadn't gone too far ahead, Ishin could reach them within minutes. Any remotely threatening wildlife that wandered into his teleportation domain was immediately relocated 6 feet under. Out of sight, out of mind, as they say, Ishin mused, keeping pace behind Nejire. On top of that, whenever his precognition flagged a branch, loose rock, or uneven step that might trip her up, he quietly teleported it away before she could reach it. As they continued their rescue mission that started off a bad feeling, Ishin momentarily faltered, and could only watch until Nejire opened her mouth to speak. A moment later, Nejire spoke. "Shunchan? Yeah? You know that rainbow world I always see but you don't? Yeah? Well," she said thoughtfully, "I was just thinking. I feel like I only see it when I'm around you. Is that so?" "Yeah. At first I thought it was the house, but then I saw it at the dojo and even at school, so I figured it was the neighborhood." Nejire continued, voice bouncing with excitement. "And?" Ishin prompted carefully. "Well, since I'm still seeing it now and we're definitely not in that neighborhood, it has to be you. I'm kind of amazed you blamed the neighborhood before me." Ishin inwardly complained. "So," Nejire went on, "how do you do it?" While she didn't turn around, probably to make sure she didn't run into a tree, she also didn't like silence in general. Which was why she made the occasional comment about Ishin keeping up with her pace. But with a question that festered since she first saw that rainbow world, Nejire assumed that it was a good time to ask, and it also filled up the silence. A win-win. Ring. Ring. Perfect timing. While Ishin could see into the future within his omniscient domain, outside factors such as a phone call originating beyond its range were harder to predict unless he sacrificed range for precision. And since he was prioritizing range for the search, his precognition only extended about a second ahead. Ishin slowed to a stop and quickly answered the call from Keiko. "Help, BZZT. Shunkuin, BZZT." The line cut out. Ishin stared at the phone. The call had dropped. Chapter 17, Childhood 16. Ishin didn't waste a second. He reached out his hand into open air, and the next moment Nejire was in front of him. While Ishin could teleport without using himself as the reference point, it was much more efficient to use himself as a reference point because it meant he could teleport further. "Whoa!" Nejire yelped as the world lurched. Colors smeared for half a heartbeat before snapping back into focus. She blinked, disoriented, then looked down to see Ishin's fingers locked tightly around her own. They held hands often, usually because Nejire insisted, and sometimes just because it felt natural, but Ishin almost never initiated it. So when Nejire felt the familiar palm of her best friend, instead of panicking at the sudden displacement, Nejire found herself oddly comforted. However, Ishin didn't bother explaining, closing his eyes. In terms of mutant changes from their own quirks, Ishin was basically a pro-max version of Genzai. Ishin's quirk didn't rely on conventional sight the way most people understood it. His quirk, an extreme evolution of Genzai's hypercognition, meant that vision was only one of many inputs feeding into his omniscient domain, or his senses. He didn't need to see in order to see. Sight was just another variable, completely redundant. So he shut it off. He inhaled once, then held it, cutting out scent and dulling taste, stripping away every variable that wasn't strictly necessary for his omniscient domain. Now, having removed 2.5 redundant variables for his omniscient domain to register, his available range was effectively doubled. He hadn't done it before because there he didn't feel much of a need to rush. But his mom's emergency call changed that. "I have to get to them now." He teleported. "No one." Ishin clenched his jaw in tension and teleported again. And again. And again. The moment new information registered, he jumped, never giving his mind time to settle. Data slammed into him faster than his brain was used to processing, even with his high computation speed. Ishin ignored everything that wasn't important. Teleport, scan, teleport. Teleport, scan, teleport. Each jump crammed new data into his skull before the last batch had finished registering. His temples throbbed. White static could be felt at the edges of his thoughts. "This is giving me a headache." Where? He repeated like a mantra. He teleported. Again and again. 5 seconds. 5 seconds of teleporting and scanning 5 times a second. 50 scans. 50 teleports. Then, human movement. Ishin froze mid-thought, narrowing his focus on the silhouettes forming in his domain. 6 people. His family. Nejire's family. They were running from something outside of his range, but they were unharmed. The relief hit him so hard it almost knocked the breath from his lungs. He teleported once more, pulling them fully into the range of his teleportation domain, then stopped. GH. A hiss slipped out as he finally released his breath. His knees nearly buckled. He brought his free hand up to his head, fingers digging into his vanilla-colored hair as he pressed against his temple. Phew-uck. The thought came unfiltered. But now that they were in his domain, Ishin could say with 99.9% confidence that they were perfectly safe. The headache was literal shit, sure, but his teleportation was still usable. That meant he could protect them with near-perfect certainty. Phew, light work, no reaction. Nejire, on the other hand, was not having a good time. Even with a stomach that could handle barrel rolls, sudden dives, and the occasional loop-de-loop using her quirk, the rapid-fire environment shifts made everything churn unpleasantly. Her ears, her eyes, her sense of balance, none of it could keep up. Ishin was teleporting once every 0.2 seconds, and unlike him, or Genzai, Nejire didn't have hypercognition or something similar to reduce that sensory lag. Motion sickness hit hard. The only thing saving her was the forest itself. Tree after tree blurred together, similar enough that her brain and eyes didn't have to completely reprocess every jump. Still, it sucked. Nejire rubbed her stomach with her free hand. Ugh. Her face went a little green. She genuinely felt like she might throw up. And yet, her grip on Ishin's hand tightened. Partly because it was rare for him to hold on like this. Mostly because she wanted something solid to brace against just in case he decided to do that thing again. He looked like he'd swallowed several lemons, his face scrunched in pain, hair a mess from his frantic attempt at massaging his own head. Seeing someone who looked worse off than she felt, Nejire's motion sickness slipped to the back of her mind. Shunchan. Without letting go of their intertwined hands, Nejire used her free hand to steady him. Are you okay? Do you need help? She pushed down the urge to shake him as the questions tumbled out. Should I call Mom? First, your mom is the one who needs rescuing, so I don't know how you're planning to call her, Ishin muttered. Second, please lower your voice. It's making it worse. His expression softened slightly as he looked at Nejire, who was now right up in his face, copying his temple massage. Except she wasn't really massaging it, just rubbing it and messing up his hair even more. He didn't bother stopping her. If she thought it was helping, who was he to argue? His eyebrows stayed furrowed though as the lingering throb refused to go away. Never doing that shit again? After a few seconds, his face settled back into its usual neutral expression. Since the search party was now fully inside his domain, the rescue itself was basically complete. I'm fine. Nejire studied him for a moment. When he looked normal again, she figured it was safe to ask what just happened, but Ishin cut her off before she could speak. I'll explain when we get back. She hesitated, full of curiosity, but nodded. They were still technically on a rescue mission. Ishin teleported them ahead, placing them directly along the path the search group was taking. Now all they had to do was wait for them to arrive. That was when Ishin noticed what they were running from. Information poured into his mind, and he blinked, eyebrows lifting in genuine confusion as a curse slipped out before he could stop it. What the actual fuck is that? Chapter 18, Childhood 17. What the actual fuck is that? Now fully within his range, Ishin's first instinct was to put it 6 feet under. But the moment he properly saw the outline of the thing's body, he froze. Is that a goddamn skinwalker? Its hind legs were far longer than its front ones, the proportions warped and wrong, and its face was vaguely human, just enough to be unsettling. Its stomach was grotesquely deformed, antlers jutting straight through its torso as black blood oozed from the wounds. And yet the thing didn't even seem to register the pain. Its face was locked into a permanent expression of agony, like someone was slowly tearing its soul out. Its arms looked like what bat limbs might be without wings, ending in claws reminiscent of oversized ant pincers. As it ran, a human face began to form in its stomach, frozen in an expression of sheer terror. Its jaw hung open, revealing a circular ring of teeth like a leech's, interspersed with jagged insect-like fangs that clearly didn't belong or fit, seeing as blood was oozing out them as well. It let out a constant low groan that sounded eerily like, "Help, help!" its glassy eyes and oversized ears twitching every so often. What happened to MHA? Ishin thought grimly. Did I somehow get transmigrated into the SCP world while I wasn't looking? He frowned, staring at what looked like a textbook example of something you'd put in a horror movie. What's what? Nejire asked, noticing Ishin's expression shift from confusion to outright disgust. She followed his line of sight, which showed nothing. And hey, no cursing, she added a beat later. Ishin ignored her. No way in hell I'm letting a kid see that. Not even considering himself when he made that decision, Ishin immediately changed his plan from waiting for the search party to come back to give him time to ignore the headache. With a thought, the Hado family and his own were teleported directly in front of them. Go faster, Shunkuen? Keiko started, only to stop short when the scenery abruptly changed. The moment hypercognition registered Ishin standing in front of him, Genzai promptly dropped to the ground, exhausted. Some may think that it's not very parent-like of him to immediately rely on a child in a life-threatening situation, but Ishin was an outlier. Genzai, what are you doing, Nejire? Mitsuru blurted out, confusion replacing his concern as he spotted his daughter. Hi, Dad. Nejire waved cheerfully. Mitsuru waved back without thinking, still holding onto his mother, Tomo, with his other hand. Hi, he said, then froze. Wait, what about the thing that was chasing us? Father. I'm right here, Genji said calmly. Though disoriented, he glanced down at the tracker in his hand while his daughter-in-law, far more physically capable than him, kept a steady grip on his other arm. Deciding to ask the questions later, the current issue was with that monster chasing them through the forest. Did it stop chasing us? Genji asked. He frowned at the tracker. The red dot representing the creature jittered unnaturally, lurching forward, then snapping back. Showing that dot to the rest of the adults, some of the more quick-witted ones, Shirori and Mitsuru and Ishin's parents, looked at Ishin. For Genzai and Keiko it was rather obvious who was the culprit behind that glitching, while for Shirori and Mitsuru, it obviously wasn't Nejire, and if the others could, they would have done that already. Ishin met their gazes and gave a small nod. Yeah. Me, he gestured with his eyebrow. Why aren't you, you know? Keiko asked hesitantly, subtly pointing downward. She didn't know about Ishin's dismantling aspect, so her only idea of dealing with such creatures was his original method, putting them 6 feet under. Well, Ishin tried and failed to mime "this looks like an experiment" with vague gestures. He gave up. Instead, he glanced at Mitsuru, then at Nejire. Nejire still hadn't let go of Ishin's hand, nor did it even look like it was about to happen anytime soon. Mitsuru immediately looked at Nejire in confusion, then looked at the two hands that were intertwined, forced down a fond smile, and put on an angry expression. Hado Nejire. The sudden shift in tone sent a chill straight down Nejire's spine. Yes? What exactly are you doing out here? Keiko added, catching on immediately. In the woods. Without adult supervision. Didn't you say Shunchan counted as supervision? Nejire tried weakly. With that being the only counter-argument she had, she subtly looked away from her parents, looking towards Ishin for assistance. Ishin was already looking the other way. Traitor. Nejire puffed out her cheeks. Hado Nejire, her mother called, thoroughly amused. Come over here. You're getting a talking to. This wasn't the time or place for punishment, and Ishin clearly wanted Nejire out of the discussion anyway. Shirori gently grabbed a defeated Nejire and guided her a short distance away. Nejire attempted to appeal to Ishin's emotional side with puppy eyes on the way, but her head was turned back by Shirori before Ishin could even turn around. Darn it. I'm totally dragging Shunchan everywhere when we get home, so he's always exhausted. Nejire sulked internally. Now that Nejire was out of the picture, Ishin thought it was appropriate to give a 3-line summary. I can teleport. To explain to the Hado family. The thing chasing you isn't human, but there's still a person inside it. Why he didn't immediately put it 6 feet under. And it looks like some kind of experiment that escaped. Why Nejire wasn't included. Perfect. How bad can it be? Genji asked. Tomo nodded uncertainly. Pretty bad. Ishin tried to explain what it looked like, but gave up after a few seconds. He looked towards Keiko and Genzai, who each gave a nod. He teleported the creature into the air, then teleported it back into the air just before gravity could take effect. All 5 adults stared at the hovering abomination. Disgust. Fear. Horror. Like father, like son, Genzai's reaction was immediate and heartfelt. What the fuck is that? Chapter 19, Childhood 18. At the sight of the monstrosity, all of the adults instinctively backed away a few steps. What the fuck is that? Genzai muttered before Keiko smacked him across the back. No cursing. Hey. There's no way that isn't your first reaction. Genzai shot back, gesturing wildly at the thing hovering before them. The creature hung awkwardly in the air, staring at them with a greedy, unfocused gaze. Its mouth opened and closed as thick, blood-stained drool dripped from leech-like teeth. Well, even Keiko couldn't argue with that, and she clicked her tongue, backing off. Genji cautiously stepped closer, circling toward the creature's swollen midsection. His eyes narrowed as he noticed something protruding through the flesh, deer antlers unmistakably so. He glanced back at Ishin. It's safe to approach if you want. As Genji moved in, Genzai leaned toward Ishin and whispered urgently, Are you sure it's safe? Why would I lie? Ishin snapped back quietly, eyebrows raised in disbelief. So I can watch Nejire's grandpa die? Maybe it was the creature's sheer presence, or maybe the information influx from hypercognition giving Genzai a headache, but Genzai's common sense seemed to have short-circuited. Flushing, he nodded quickly and retreated to Keiko's side instead of digging himself deeper. Genji examined the stomach more closely, then looked back at Ishin. Can you take out Moriyama? Yeah, Ishin replied, hesitant but certain. With omniscient domain in its natural state, Ishin constantly received topographical data, normally supplemented by his other senses to create a coherent picture. That was why, when precognition activated, it didn't just return vague outlines like radar, giving the future projections color. However, if Ishin deliberately shrunk the range of the omniscient domain, the accuracy increased qualitatively. This meant that Ishin could basically see inside the monster and analyze everything perfectly like it was X-ray vision if the domain was small enough. Shrinking and increasing the domain in exchange for increased or decreased information did require some focus. Genji glanced between Ishin and the stomach. Is he alive? Yes. Somehow there were 2 heartbeats inside the creature. One came from its chest, where a human heart should be. The other pulsed weakly from within its stomach. When Ishin focused there, the image made his stomach twist violently. Moriyama was barely recognizable, reduced to a mangled mass of flesh. Bones were bent at impossible angles, blood pooling freely inside the creature's stomach. Worse, his flesh was fusing with the monster's inner lining. Ishin barely had time to turn away before vomiting what little he'd eaten that morning. His enhanced senses betrayed him completely. He could smell the rotting and fusing flesh, see the flowing blood, hear the further cracking of already broken bones. His legs gave out and he dropped to his knees, heaving. Shunkuin. Keiko rushed to his side immediately, rubbing his back. Tomo followed close behind. Even knowing Ishin for less than a day, watching a child in pain was unbearable for any mother. Ishin had always thought of himself as somewhat desensitized to gore. Not because he was edgy or cared about blood or anything, but having a childhood with unrestricted internet access meant that he inevitably saw some fucked up things. He could watch movies that people considered cursed and look at images of gore with only a wince and a weird feeling throughout his body. This was different. This was a 4-dimensional version. Smell, sound, depth, no screen between him and reality. Damn it, this is killing me, he thought hazily as tears streamed from his eyes and his throat burned. However, desensitization was the best method with his mind, as Ishin, instead of automatically dismissing his hyperanalysis, merely kept paying attention to it, but trying to also distance himself from it mentally. Kind of like how an experienced doctor could look at a patient from a detached point of view. After throwing up the rest of his meal, Ishin started dry heaving, a natural physical reaction. However, his mind was already ignoring the pain and focusing solely on the monster. Tomo pressed a water bottle into his hands. Ishin drank automatically, barely registering it. If Ishin didn't do anything about Moriyama, then his death was only inevitable. His heart may still be beating, but he also had to stop the fusing inside the monster's stomach. However, this fusing also told Ishin something. This monster wasn't just a monster. It was something with a quirk. Hyperanalysis confirmed it, a human brain, a human heart. This thing had been a person. And inside its flesh there was something like a tracker. After confirming that, Ishin immediately dismantled the device. He didn't know its purpose, but leaving it intact wasn't worth the risk. Finishing the bottle, Ishin took a few deep breaths. Only then did he finally register the worried faces around him. "I'm fine now," he said quietly. Yet even with that reassurance, Keiko still hovered close to Ishin, worried that something might happen again. Ishin turned to Genji. "The person inside is still alive." "Is that so?" Genji exclaimed. Before he could say more, Tomo yanked his ear hard. "Is that what you're focused on right now? Didn't you see the kid nearly collapse?" Genji winced, chastened. "I'm really fine," Ishin insisted, cutting in. Tomo shot Genji a glare before exhaling and letting go. "I can get him out," Ishin continued, voice steady but strained. "But he didn't need to finish." Every adult present understood, their expressions darkening. "What do we do then?" Mitsuru asked tightly. "The nearest hospital is an hour away and it's just a clinic." "Even with an ambulance it's impossible," Genji added. Silence fell. One by one their eyes drifted toward the same person. Ishin. With what he'd already shown, getting Moriyama to a proper hospital would be easy for him. But after watching him break down, after seeing how hard he was forcing himself to stand, no one could bring themselves to ask. This was supposed to be the adult's responsibility. Leaving it to an elementary schooler wasn't right. No matter how capable he seemed, Ishin was still just a child. So what were they supposed to do? Chapter 20, Childhood 19. A few seconds passed with no one coming up with a good idea, while Ishin pushed his focus deeper into the monster's insides. Couldn't I teleport this guy's body back together? It was a stray thought that Ishin had, and it was undeniably possible. While Ishin couldn't see individual cells, he could distinguish organs and structures. With how splicing worked and with the formula he'd modified a while back to allow for perfect welding, it could be done. But even with that capability, Ishin had never bothered learning anatomy in full. After all, life or death situations didn't happen every day. Yet now, staring into the creature, the only reason Moriyama was still alive was because being fused with the monster was forcibly supplying his heart with blood and oxygen. Damn it! Ishin clenched his hand in frustration. Death was something Ishin was painfully familiar with. In the middle of college classes and a part-time job, a call that should have been ordinary had announced the deaths of both his parents. The people who raised him. The people who loved him. He had spoken to his mother about what to eat for dinner that night. He had talked with his father about getting a driver's license. No goodbyes. No last meeting. They were gone. And they weren't coming back. Ishin knew what it felt like to come home expecting warmth, only to be met with silence. An empty house far too large for one person. Days spent without speaking a word. It hurt. Nejire had told him about Moriyama on the way here. About his son. About how he still played with her, even with dementia. About how kind he was. The odds of Moriyama surviving were almost non-existent. But did that mean he had to die? Did Nejire need to experience death so young? The kind of parting that comes far too early. The kind where you go to someone's house to play, only for them to never be there again. Ishin was just about to make up his mind, even if it meant pushing his quirk until his head went blank, when Genji spoke. Let's give him a peaceful ending. Tomo and Mitsuru turned to Genji in shock. Before and even after Moriyama's dementia, Genji and Moriyama had been inseparable. Best friends in every sense of the word. If anyone wasn't expected to say it, it was Genji. And yet, Tomo understood. Even before Moriyama's condition worsened, every conversation had been painful. Every time Genji went up the mountain to retrieve him, it tore something open. After all, that mountain was where they had played as children. Almost every adult in the village had memories there. Maybe, before Moriyama forgot everything, it was better for him to die like this. Genji grimaced. Old age brought experience with goodbyes, but being forced to choose between your best friend dying in peace or living in constant suffering. There had only ever been one answer. Ishin looked at Genji, uncertainty tightening his chest. Even if he could be the executioner, it didn't mean he wanted to be. Death was a farewell. Before he could finish the thought, Tomo stepped forward, glaring at Genji. Genji, she said sharply. Are you really prepared to put blood on a child's hands? That was enough to make Keiko speak up. She didn't think she had the right to interfere in something as personal as a neighbor's death, but she couldn't allow that. Ishin will not be the one to kill him. She wrapped her arms around Ishin protectively, while Genzai stepped behind him, steadying his shoulders. Genji stared, confused, then realization hit him. "Oh no," he said quickly. "I'd never ask the kid to do that. Who do you think I am?" He exhaled, then continued, voice firm. "What I need to know is, can you keep him still without whatever you're doing now?" As long as Ishin maintained the teleportation, it meant he could still see it. That was how quirks like his usually worked, even if he didn't know the specifics. And Genji didn't want Ishin to witness a farewell. Ishin gave a hesitant nod. He could embed it halfway into stone, sink it into the ground, or form a cage. Embedding it felt wrong. So instead, he teleported massive tree trunks into place, locking around the monster's limbs. It immobilized the creature while leaving its stomach visible. Genji studied the makeshift cage and nodded, then turned to Mitsuru. "Get Saburo." Mitsuru started to move, but Ishin stopped him. "He's already here." From the bushes emerged a rugged old man with a thick beard and 2 long antennae jutting from his head. "Genji." "Saburo." Saburo's eyes went to the monster, then back to Genji. "Is that Moriyama?" "Yeah," Genji said quietly. "He's inside." Only Genji and Saburo had the tracker, too expensive for anyone else, and the 3 of them had been inseparable for years. If Genji decided to say goodbye, it was only right for Saburo to participate. Saburo walked closer, eyes narrowing as he spotted the deer antlers protruding from the monster's stomach. He stopped. After a few seconds, his permanent scowl deepened. "How'd he end up like this?" Saburo asked. Genji opened his mouth. "The monster." "Obviously the monster ate him, you imbecile," Saburo snapped, then sighed. He glanced at Tomo. "You're better at this." Tomo followed his gaze to Ishin. Saburo turned, taking in the scene properly now, 2 adults tense and guarded, and a kid standing calmly between them. The gun on his back didn't help their nerves. The kid's lack of fear told Saburo everything. This was the one who helped. Saburo approached Ishin, then knelt so they were eye to eye, his expression softening. "Thank you."